Hey guys, tonight we are drifting back, way back, to a time when the nights were truly dark and the world was lit by flickering flames and moonlight, if you were lucky. We're settling into the shadowy corners of the Georgian era, roughly 1714 to 1837, and we're going to explore a rather curious phenomenon, the gentle art, or perhaps the unsettling habit, of sleepwalking. Imagine it. No streetlights humming outside your window, no reassuring glow from a smartphone screen, just deep, inky blackness once the candles are snuffed. You're in a grand, or maybe not so grand, Georgian house. Floorboards creak with a life of their own, the wind whispers through ill-fitting window panes, and somewhere someone is rising from their bed, eyes vacant, moving through the darkness as if guided by an unseen hand. It's a world of whispered tales, medical bafflement, and genuine everyday peril for those who wandered in their slumber. You probably won't survive this journey tonight without dozing off, which, frankly, is the entire point. But if you were actually a Georgian sleepwalker navigating those drafty, obstacle-strewn homes, let's just say your chances of a stubbed toe, or worse, were exceptionally high. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, as always, I'd love to see where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always fascinating to see our little community of night owls. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The last candle has been pinched out, its wisp of smoke coiling up into the cold air of the bedchamber, a faint, acrid scent mingling with the stale lavender that was perhaps strewn amongst the linens. You're lying in a four-poster bed, cocooned by heavy drapes meant to keep out the chill, but even they can't entirely defeat the pervasive Georgian damp. The silence of the house presses in, a thick, almost tangible thing, quite unlike the hum-filled quiet of our modern nights. Out there, beyond your door, the house is a labyrinth of unseen objects and sudden drops. There are no little sensor lights guiding your way to the loo, which, by the way, might just be a porcelain pot under your bed if you're lucky, or a chilly trek to an outhouse if you're not. It's in this profound darkness, this world devoid of our familiar electric glow, that our sleepwalkers begin their strange nocturnal theater. You feel a peculiar lightness, a disconnection. Your limbs seem to move with a will separate from your conscious thought. It's not a dream, not quite. But the world around you as you now perceive it is filtered, muted, perhaps imbued with an odd significance. The chill of the bare floorboards, probably oak or wide-planked pine, seeps into the soles of your feet. You'd think the shock of it would wake you, but it doesn't. It's just another sensation in this curious, gliding state. Georgian houses, particularly the grander ones, were notorious for being drafty. Even with fires banked in the hearths of the main rooms, the heat rarely made a dent in the icy corridors or the upper floors where many slept. This omnipresent cold is a constant companion for our nocturnal wanderer. Your night clothes, likely a simple linen shift or a nightshirt, offer little protection as you begin to move. What is compelling you? In the Georgian mind, this was a profound mystery. Was it the devil's work? A touch of lunacy brought on by the moon, as the very word lunatic suggests? Or perhaps, as some of the more forward-thinking physicians were beginning to theorize, it was a disorder of the nerves, an imbalance of the humors, or even, and this is a good one, the result of eating too much cheese before bed. Yes, the Georgians loved their cheese, but they also blamed it for a multitude of sins, including nightmares and, apparently, impromptu nighttime strolls. It's easy for us to chuckle at these notions, armed with our 21st century neuroscience. But for them, the sleepwalking figure was a genuine enigma, a breach of the natural order of night and rest. The house around you creaks. Is it the timbers settling, a mouse skittering in the wainscoting, or something else? The shadows cast by the sliver of moonlight, if any pierces the thick curtains or wooden shutters, twist familiar shapes into grotesque forms. A coat slung over a chair becomes a lurking figure. A grandfather clock in the hall doesn't just tick. It counts down heartbeats in the oppressive silence. Historians still argue whether the perceived rise in detailed accounts of sleepwalking during the Georgian period truly reflected an increase in its incidence, or if it was simply that people were becoming more inclined to document such curiosities, part of the era's burgeoning interest in the self and its oddities. It might also be that with more people living in closer proximity in growing towns and cities, these nocturnal wanderings were simply more likely to be observed and commented upon. You drift past a dressing table, its silver-backed brushes glinting faintly. Good luck trying to navigate these hallways with one of those towering powdered wigs some Georgians sported during the day. You'd be leaving a trail of white dust like a very clumsy Hansel. Imagine the gentle scrape of your bare feet on the wooden stairs, each step a potential betrayal, threatening to send you tumbling into the unlit void below. Safety features? Non-existent. No conveniently placed handrails designed to modern codes, no baby gates at the top of the perilously steep servant stairs. For a sleepwalker, a Georgian home was an unyielding obstacle course. One quirky tidbit often forgotten is that windows, especially in grander homes, might open quite wide and often lacked secure fastenings or any kind of safety bar, making an unintended defenestration a terrifying, if rare, possibility for the somnambulant. They weren't exactly thinking about toddler-proofing or sleepwalker-proofing back then. Survival of the fittest applied even to nighttime excursions within your own home. The air grows colder as you descend, perhaps drawn towards the dying embers of the kitchen hearth. Or maybe nowhere in particular. The very concept of what drove a sleepwalker was a source of immense speculation. Was the soul temporarily detached, wandering on its own errand? Did the body enact fragments of dreams? If you suddenly got the munchies mid-sleepwalk, your options were grim. Forget raiding a brightly lit fridge. You'd be fumbling in a dark pantry for a hunk of stale bread, or if you were really unlucky, a raw potato. Not exactly the midnight feast of champions. The Georgians, with their rudimentary understanding of the brain, were explorers in a dark continent when it came to the mind. They observed, they recorded, they sometimes feared, but they rarely understood the whys and wherefores of these ghostly perambulations. The shadows dance and you move with them, an unconscious actor on a silent, darkened stage. The first act of your nightly, unintended drama just beginning. You've reached the bottom of the stairs now, or perhaps you're halfway down, each step a potential plunge into, well, more darkness. This isn't the soft, blue-tinged dark of a modern city night, punctuated by the distant glow of street lamps or the amber blush of 1,000 windows. This is a profound, oppressive blackness, the kind that swallows light whole. If the moon is new or the sky is thick with cloud, you might as well be at the bottom of a well. Imagine extending your hand and it simply vanishing, not even a faint outline visible. Your eyes, fully dilated, strain to find any point of reference, any variation in the pitch black, but mostly they find nothing. This is the realm of the true pre-industrial night, an experience almost entirely lost to us today, unless you find yourself in a very remote wilderness or deep inside a cave. Good luck finding the outhouse in this without a seeing-eyed dog and a hefty dose of courage. The air itself feels different in this total darkness. It seems to press in on you, heavy and still, or it whispers past with unseen currents, carrying strange scents from the scullery, the lingering aroma of yesterday's boiled cabbage, or perhaps the faint metallic tang of damp stone from the cellar. Your other senses, desperately trying to compensate for the lack of sight, become almost painfully acute. The creak of a floorboard under your own weight is a gunshot in the silence. The distant bark of a dog half a mile away feels like it's just outside the window. You can hear the scuttling of unseen creatures within the walls. Mice, certainly. Perhaps rats in less salubrious dwellings. Sounds that during the day would be masked by the hubbub of life. At night, they are the soundtrack to your solitary wanderings. If you're in a town or city, the darkness might be slightly less absolute than in the deep countryside. A few oil lamps might feebly illuminate notorious corners, or a wealthy merchant might pay for a lantern outside his own house, casting a small, flickering pool of unreliable light that only serves to make the surrounding shadows deeper and more menacing. But these are mere pinpricks. The vast majority of urban streets are unlit, treacherous pathways slick with mud, refuse, and who knows what else. Remember those chamber pots? Their contents often found their way onto the streets, making a nocturnal, unseeing stroll a truly fragrant and squishy undertaking. No wonder people who had to be out at night, like the night watchman, carried lanterns. You, our gentle sleepwalker, have no such aid. This pervasive darkness naturally shaped how people experienced the night. One significant historical fact is that sleep patterns were often segmented. Many Georgians, and indeed people throughout pre-industrial Europe, experienced what's known as first sleep and second sleep. They'd go to bed not long after dusk, sleep for several hours, then wake up for an hour or two around midnight. This waking period, known as the watch, was a time for prayer, reflection, quiet chores by firelight if it was kept going, intimate conversation, or even visiting neighbors. Then they would return to bed for their second sleep until morning. It's in this liminal state, this accepted period of wakefulness in the dead of night, that a sleepwalker might easily blend in, at least initially, if found stirring by another household member. Who's to say if you're in your watch or just taking an exceptionally deep dive into it? The rhythm of sleep itself was a different country. For us, an unbroken 8 hours is the ideal, often elusive. For them, sleep was a punctuated affair, a dip into oblivion followed by a resurfacing into a quiet, intensely personal period of wakefulness before the next immersion. This interlude of quiet consciousness in the heart of the night must have felt very different from our bleary-eyed midnight bathroom trips. It was an expected, normal part of the night structure. The sheer, unrelenting blackness of the Georgian night was a powerful psychological force. It bred fear, superstition, and the sense of the unknown lurking just beyond your fingertips. Darkness was when ghosts and goblins were thought to roam, when witches held their Sabbaths, and when the devil was believed to be most active. Imagine, then, the impact of seeing a figure, perhaps a family member, moving silently through this Stygian gloom, eyes open but unseeing. It's no wonder sleepwalkers were sometimes feared as being possessed or under some supernatural influence. The very stage upon which their actions took place, this absolute unnerving darkness, amplified the mystery and the terror. You're not just walking down the hall, you're a spectral figure emerging from an abyss. It's enough to make anyone reach for the smelling salts or possibly a sturdy crucifix. The darkness was a canvas upon which all sorts of anxieties and beliefs could be projected. Every unexplained noise, every fleeting shadow gained significance. Historians still argue whether the consistent exposure to such profound darkness and the quieter rhythms of pre-industrial life actually fostered different states of consciousness, perhaps leading to more vivid hypnagogic or hypnopompic experiences, those strange visions and sensations we sometimes get when falling asleep or waking up. Could it be that the boundary between waking and dreaming was more porous, making the transition into sleepwalking somehow more common, or at least more readily accepted as part of life's weirder tapestries? We, with our electrically illuminated nights, have largely banished this profound darkness, and with it perhaps a certain quality of introspection or even a type of imaginative landscape. Our dreams today are perhaps less influenced by the profound, all-encompassing dark, less shaped by the deep quiet where every tiny sound had meaning. A quirky tidbit from the era involves the night hag or mare, a creature from folklore believed to press down on sleepers' chests, causing terrifying paralysis and bad dreams, what we now understand as sleep paralysis. In the deep dark, where every shadow could be a threat, attributing such experiences to a malevolent entity rather than a neurological hiccup makes a certain kind of terrified sense. Your breath catches in your throat. Was that a sigh of the wind or something else? You brush against a piece of furniture, a sturdy oak coffer perhaps, or a delicate spindle-legged table. The tactile sensation is sharp, real, yet you process it through a haze. If you're lucky, you only collect a bruise. A little too unlucky. And that lovely porcelain wash basin and ewer could end up as 1,000 glittering shards on the floor, a sound guaranteed to wake anyone not already comatose. I bet they didn't have a 24-hour emergency porcelain repair service back then. The resulting mess would be discovered in the cold light of morning. Another inexplicable event in the household's silent night. The darkness is your world now. It's cold, it's silent save for the tiny sounds magnified by the gloom, and it's completely, utterly, and unapologetically black. This is the canvas upon which your unconscious mind is painting its strange masterpiece. Every creak, every breath of air, every unseen obstacle is a part of this invisible landscape you navigate. You are moving through a forgotten sensory world, one where sight is a dethroned monarch and touch, hearing, and even smell reign supreme, albeit in a distorted, dreamlike fashion. The world is not absent. It's just perceived through an entirely different and much darker lens. Your fingertips might trail along a cold stone wall seeking guidance that your eyes cannot provide, mapping the contours of your surroundings through a primal sense of touch that we, in our lit world, rarely need to fully engage. You continue your silent journey through the inky blackness, a vessel adrift on an unseen current. But what, in the Georgian imagination, was actually propelling you? What did they believe set your limbs in motion while your conscious mind was, presumably, off somewhere else, frolicking with dream sheep or anxiously reliving the day's embarrassments? The theories were a fascinating and sometimes bewildering mix of ancient philosophy, religious doctrine, folk belief, and the very beginnings of what we might loosely term psychological inquiry. It wasn't as simple as saying their brain made them do it. Oh no, it was far more baroque than that. One dominant line of thought, inherited from classical thinkers like Aristotle and Galen, involved the humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. An imbalance in these vital fluids was believed to cause all manner of physical and mental ailments. Perhaps an excess of melancholy or black bile was thought to weigh down the spirit, leading to restless nights and agitated wanderings. Picture a solemn physician contemplating a patient known for such nocturnal journeys. He might stroke his chin, gaze thoughtfully at a chart of the humors, and declare that the patient suffered from an overabundance of black bile, making their nights uneasy and their spirit prone to straying. or maybe a surge of hot blood, not properly cooled by the night air due to an overly rich supper or feverish thoughts, inflamed the animal spirits residing in the brain, causing the body to act out the phantoms of a fevered imagination. Picture a physician, serious-faced and bewigged, sagely nodding as he suggests a course of bleeding to release the excess hot blood, or a purging concoction of bitter herbs to rebalance your disturbed humors and hopefully keep you tucked in your bed. A bit of leech therapy for that midnight stroll, madam? Or perhaps a strong dose of jalap to clear the passages? Should clear it right up. It sounds barbaric to our modern ears, accustomed to understanding brain chemistry, but it was standard medical procedure applied with earnest conviction. Then, there was the soul. The concept of the soul's relationship to the body during sleep was a rich field for speculation. Some believe that during sleep, the rational soul, the seat of reason and consciousness, took its leave, or at least retreated into a quieter part of the being, allowing the more primitive, instinctual parts of the being, the animal soul, to take over. If this animal soul was particularly restless, perhaps agitated by undigested food, that troublesome cheese again making its appearance in theories, or troubling thoughts and anxieties carried over from the day, it might cause the body to move, to act out base impulses or unfulfilled desires. It's like the mind's butler has gone off duty, and the footmen, less disciplined and more prone to mischief, are having a bit of an unsupervised party in the hallways of your physique. Historians still argue whether such distinctions between different souls or spirits within a person were understood literally by all, or perhaps more metaphorically by the average Georgian, as a way of explaining the inexplicable duality of human behavior during sleep. Dreams themselves were, of course, central to many theories. Were you merely acting out a particularly vivid dream? This idea has persisted into modern times, although we now understand that most complex sleepwalking, or somnambulism, doesn't typically occur during REM sleep, the stage most associated with vivid dreaming, but rather in the deeper stages of non-REM sleep. But for the Georgians, if you were found attempting to climb the heavy velvet curtains of your bedchamber, it was perfectly reasonable to assume you dreamt you were scaling a sheer mountain cliff or escaping a burning building depicted in a popular novel. The connection seemed self-evident. The content of these dreams, if they could be guessed at from your mumbled words or actions, might offer clues. Were they tormented dreams, indicating a guilty conscience, unexpressed fears, or perhaps even spiritual distress that needed addressing through prayer or penance? Or merely adventurous ones reflecting a bold spirit even in repose? Religious interpretations also loomed large, casting a more ominous shadow. A sleepwalker, especially one whose nocturnal actions were bizarre, disturbing, or seemed out of character, might be seen as someone susceptible to demonic influence or even partial possession. If the rational soul was considered less vigilant during sleep, less in command of the bodily fortress, it left a potential opening for mischievous or downright malevolent spirits to enter and take the body for an unholy joyride. This was naturally a terrifying prospect, both for the sleepwalker should they become aware of such interpretations, and for their family, who might fear for their loved one's eternal soul. Exorcism, while becoming less common in mainstream practice by the Georgian period than in, say, the peak of the witch hunts a century or two earlier, wasn't entirely off the table in extreme interpretations, especially in more devout or isolated communities. Still, the whiff of the uncanny, the sense that something not quite right, not quite of this world, was at play, clung tenaciously to the figure of the sleepwalker. One particularly interesting historical fact is the lingering belief in what was sometimes called sympathy. The idea that invisible forces or emanations could connect people and objects over distances, a concept with roots in Renaissance magic and Neoplatonism. Perhaps the sleepwalker was drawn towards something or someone by an unseen sympathetic thread. Maybe they were unconsciously seeking a lost object of sentimental value or a person they were deeply concerned about, their sleeping body responding to an emotional pull that their conscious mind couldn't articulate. This theory lent a certain romantic or tragic air to some interpretations of sleepwalking, imagining the sleeper pulled by an invisible emotional cord, a silent homing beacon. You might be found with your hand resting on a dusty portrait in a forgotten gallery, or attempting to open a locked box containing old letters, your actions imbued with a mysterious, unconscious purpose that hinted at hidden sorrows or longings. It's a far cry from our understanding of neurotransmitters and sleep stages, but it has a poignant, if not scientifically verifiable, charm. Beyond the grand theories of souls, humors, and spiritual influence, there were more prosaic, if still rather odd, notions. Certain foods, as we've mentioned, were prime suspects, with cheese holding a place of particular infamy. But heavy suppers in general were thought to sit uneasily on the stomach, fermenting and producing vapors that rose to the head, confusing the brain and leading to restless sleep and these strange perambulations. The quality of the air in the bedroom was also considered important. Was it too close, too stuffy, too miasmatic, carrying unhealthy effluvia from outside? Poor ventilation, a common problem in Georgian homes despite their draftiness, was blamed for a host of ills, and agitated sleep could be one of them. And then there was the ever-present moon, lunacy, being tied etymologically to Luna, the Roman goddess of the moon. The idea that the full moon could affect behavior, pulling on the fluids in the brain just as it pulled on the tides, had been around for centuries and remained a popular explanation for all sorts of erratic conduct, sleepwalking prominently included. If you started wandering around the time of a full moon, many would just nod knowingly, shrugging their shoulders. "Ah, the moon is at it again. Poor chap's a bit moonstruck." It's a far simpler explanation than booking a sleep study and undergoing a polysomnography. A quirky tidbit that surfaces in Georgian medical literature occasionally mentions imitation as a potential cause. If a child, for instance, observed an adult in the household sleepwalking or heard dramatic, frequently recounted stories about it, perhaps they might unconsciously mimic the behavior. It's a rudimentary nod to the power of suggestion, or what we might now consider learned behaviors, though far from our current understanding of parasomnias as neurologically based phenomena. They were also beginning to explore the rather nebulous idea of nervous afflictions, a broad and somewhat vague category that covered everything from hypochondria and hysteria to genuine neurological disorders. Sleepwalking was sometimes classed among these, seen as a symptom of an oversensitive, easily agitated or disordered nervous system. "Your nerves are simply too a-jangle, my dear," a physician might soothe. "A good tonic, less reading of those exciting Gothic novels before bed, and perhaps a brisk walk in the fresh air during the day should do the trick." You can almost hear the condescending pat on the hand accompanying such advice. So as you glide through the Stygian darkness of your Georgian home, your footsteps muffled by the thick silence, you are not just a person walking in their sleep. You are a walking embodiment of a dozen competing theories, a puzzle box of philosophical, religious, and early medical speculation. Your unconscious movements are a canvas onto which the anxieties, beliefs, and intellectual curiosities of an entire era are projected. Are you sick in body or soul? Possessed by an external force? Simply dreaming too hard and too physically? Or just a bit too fond of that Stilton and port before retiring? The Georgians offered many answers, few of them definitive, all of them painting a vivid picture of how they tried to make sense of the mind's nighttime mysteries and its occasional perplexing habit of taking the body for an unchaperoned stroll. The house settles around you, a vast, dark creature holding its breath in the pre-dawn stillness. Each footfall, however light you imagine it to be on those cold, unforgiving floorboards, seems to echo with unnatural loudness in the preternatural quiet that envelops the sleeping household. You're not just an abstract concept now, a bundle of theories about humors, wayward souls, or dietary indiscretions. You're a presence, a moving anomaly in the stillness, and someone eventually is bound to notice. It's in these initial observations, the whispered anecdotes that circulated through households like yours, from the kitchens to the drawing rooms, and then perhaps into villages and towns, eventually finding their way into letters, diaries, and the burgeoning newspapers and journals, that we begin to see the Georgian sleepwalker taking shape as a recognized social phenomenon, a curiosity to be discussed, marveled at, and sometimes feared. These weren't usually dramatic front-page news stories, not at first anyway, unless something truly extraordinary or tragic occurred. More often, they were small, curious tales shared in hushed tones. Perhaps a maidservant rising before dawn in the chill of a winter morning to light the fires and air the rooms would find the young master of the house standing stock-still in the unlit drawing room, staring blankly at a portrait of a long-dead ancestor, his eyes open but vacant, a look of profound abstraction on his face. She might gently take his arm, her heart perhaps fluttering with a mixture of fear and pity, and lead him back to the warmth of his bed, bewildered by his unresponsiveness. Later, she would whisper about it to the cook as they prepared breakfast, who would then share the tale with the boot boy when he came to collect the muddy footwear and so on. Young Master Thomas was at it again last night, the gossip might ripple. Communing with the ancestral portraits he was, said not a word, just stared like he was seeing ghosts. The servants' network in a large Georgian household was the era's equivalent of social media, only with more starched aprons and fewer cat videos, an efficient conduit for news, rumors, and oddities. Or imagine a farmer in a more rural setting, woken from his own slumber by a strange noise outside his cottage. He might peer through a small window pane, see nothing in the oppressive darkness, and then, concerned for his livestock or stores, venture out into his yard with a flickering tallow lantern held aloft. There he might find his wife meticulously trying to gather firewood into her apron, her movements precise yet somehow disconnected, even though the woodpile was already neatly stacked. She would be unresponsive to his calls until he gently shook her awake, at which point she'd look around, utterly bewildered, with no memory of her actions, perhaps only a vague, fleeting sense of having been very busy with an important though now forgotten task. These were puzzling, sometimes deeply unsettling occurrences woven into the fabric of ordinary life. What do you do with that information? Do you confide in the local vicar, seeking spiritual guidance? Do you consult the village apothecary, hoping for a potion to calm the nocturnal restlessness? Or do you just brew a strong cup of tea, ensure the doors are bolted more securely next time, and fervently hope it doesn't happen again? The line between a very vivid dream acted out momentarily upon waking, perhaps a shout, a thrashing of limbs, or sitting bolt upright in bed with eyes wide and full-blown somnambulism was often blurry and ill-defined. When did it cross the threshold from a bad night into sleepwalking proper, a recognized condition? Usually it was when the person actually got out of bed, left the perceived safety of their sleeping space, and began to navigate their surroundings, performing seemingly purposeful if often bizarre and nonsensical actions. One famous historical anecdote, recounted in various forms throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, though its exact origin is often debated, making it something of a mainstream tale nonetheless, passed down through popular literature and medical texts, involves a student who would rise in his sleep, proceed to his desk, carefully light a candle without fumbling, and then compose perfectly rational essays or solve complex mathematical problems, his handwriting clear and his logic sound. In the morning, he would have no recollection of his nocturnal labors, often surprised to find the completed work on his desk. Whether apocryphal or based on a genuine case, such stories fueled the fascination. The idea that complex, even intellectual tasks could be performed while the conscious mind, the seat of reason, was absent or otherwise engaged. It's like your brain deciding to do its homework or write that overdue report while you're snoozing. Imagine the grades you'd get, or the relief of waking to find a difficult task miraculously completed. Early reports of such behaviors were often couched in terms of wonder, mild alarm, or simple bemusement. A letter from one gentlewoman to her sister, carefully penned by candlelight, might describe a nephew who took to walking in his sleep last Tuesday, much to the consternation of the household. He was found in the pantry attempting to churn butter with the hearth brush, a most peculiar sight. Cook says he seemed quite intent upon it, though his methods were, shall we say, unconventional. These weren't formal case studies destined for a medical journal. They were curiosities, oddities of human behavior, fodder for family gossip, concerned head-shaking among relatives, and perhaps a cautious entry in a personal diary. The language used to describe these episodes would often reflect the teller's own beliefs and understanding. He seemed possessed of a strange spirit that night, or, the poor lad is clearly overwrought, his nerves are undoubtedly frayed from his studies, or simply, a most unaccountable business. Historians still argue whether the recorded instances of sleepwalking that we have from this period, the letters, the diaries, the occasional newspaper snippet, represent just the tip of the iceberg, with many more cases going undocumented, or if these recorded instances represent the most dramatic, persistent, or noteworthy cases, with milder or more infrequent episodes going largely unrecorded or unremarked upon outside the immediate family. Literacy was not universal, especially in the earlier part of the Georgian era, and even for those who could read and write, not every domestic oddity was deemed worthy of precious paper, ink, and time. It's highly likely that many a sleepwalking episode, especially if it resulted in no significant harm or major disruption, simply became part of a family's oral tradition, a strange and accepted habit of Uncle Arthur's or young cousin Jemima's that was just tolerated, if not truly understood. "Oh, that's just Arthur," a spouse might sigh to a visiting relative. "Off to inspect the state of the garden gnomes again. He does it once a month. Best leave him be, he usually finds his way back." A quirky tidbit that often appears in early accounts and medical discussions focuses with peculiar intensity on the eyes of the sleepwalker. Were they open or closed? If open, did they appear to see, to register their surroundings? Many observers insisted the eyes were wide open, yet seemed fixed, unseeing, staring straight ahead or directed inward as if contemplating some inner vision. Others reported them as closed or only partially open, fluttering as if on the verge of waking. This seemingly small detail became a point of considerable contention and fascination, as it seemed to touch upon the very nature of perception and consciousness during these enigmatic episodes. If the eyes are open but you're not seeing in the usual sense, what exactly are you experiencing? What kind of internal world are you inhabiting? This question puzzled Georgian observers greatly, and indeed still holds a certain mystery. Could you imagine trying to convince someone you weren't looking at them peeking through your fingers at a forbidden scene, but were actually deep in a somnambulistic trance, your gaze unseeing? Good luck with that alibi when confronted by an irate parent or a suspicious spouse, as the Georgian era progressed, bringing with it the rise of print culture. Newspapers became more common and affordable. Magazines like Asterisk, the Gentleman's Magazine Asterisk, catered to a curious literate audience, and pamphlets on all manner of subjects were printed and distributed. These anecdotal accounts of sleepwalking began to reach a broader public. A particularly dramatic or unusual case of sleepwalking, especially if it involved a serious accident, a near miss, some remarkable feat of navigation or skill, or occurred within a prominent family, might get a paragraph or two in a local journal or even a London paper. This gradual shift from purely private or local knowledge to a more public awareness started to frame sleepwalking less as an isolated family quirk or a village oddity, and more as a general human phenomenon that invited wider curiosity and, eventually, more systematic attempts at explanation by the medical men and early proto-psychologists of the day. You're moving silently through the dark house, a quiet testament to this slowly dawning collective awareness. The scullery maid who saw you attempting to wind the grandfather clock with a salt shaker might not write a treatise on abnormal psychology, but her whispered story to the ostler at the nearby inn, who then tells it to a traveling peddler passing through, who in turn mentions it at an alehouse in the next county. That's how the word spread, how the phenomenon seeped into the collective consciousness in a world without instant global communication or viral internet videos. The initial response within a household, when faced with a sleepwalking family member, was often simply to observe, to worry, and to try and protect. If a child was prone to walking in their sleep, a concerned parent might tie a soft string from the child's wrist to their own as they slept, hoping the tug would alert them if the child rose. Or they might place basins of cold water by the bed, believing the shock of stepping into it would wake the wanderer before they got too far. These were practical, homespun remedies and precautions born of immediate concern and parental instinct, rather than deep medical theory or complex understanding. The tales of these nocturnal adventures were shared, often with a sense of marvel at the strangeness of it all, sometimes with a frisson of superstitious fear, but the sleepwalker, in these early whispers and domestic accounts, was usually still one of ours. A family member, a neighbor, a known individual behaving strangely, rather than an anonymous specimen to be dissected by cold medical science or sensationalized by the penny press, though that would come to some extent later in the period and beyond. For now, as you navigate your darkened home, you are simply odd. Wonderfully, inexplicably, and perhaps to those who witness you a little frighteningly odd. Your unseeing eyes, open or closed, seem to gaze upon the tall, shadowed grandfather clock in the hall, its solemn tick-tock a ponderous, inescapable metronome for your peculiar and silent journey through the night. As these anecdotal whispers, these worried family letters, and the more formal, if still somewhat credulous, reports of sleepwalking began to accumulate, they naturally caught the attention of those individuals who made it their business to study the complexities of the human body and mind. The physicians, the surgeons, and the medical men of the Georgian era. Their attempts to understand, classify, and potentially treat somnambulism provide a fascinating window into the medical thinking of the time. A curious blend of ancient, inherited tradition from figures like Hippocrates and Galen, nascent scientific inquiry driven by the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and observation, and quite a bit of perplexed head-scratching in the face of such a baffling condition. It's one thing for your Aunt Mildred to declare you're just a bit fey in the night, like your poor grandmother was. It's quite another when a learned doctor in a powdered wig and silk stockings arrives at your bedside, peers at you with keen interest, and starts taking copious notes for his next lecture at the Royal College of Physicians. Physicians of the 18th and early 19th centuries were grappling with a rapidly expanding, but still very incomplete understanding of human physiology and pathology. The workings of the brain and the nervous system in particular were a hot topic of debate and investigation, though their tools were largely limited to observation, dissection of cadavers, when available and socially acceptable, and a great deal of theoretical speculation. Influential figures like the Scottish physician William Cullen, working in Edinburgh, developed elaborate classifications or nosologies of diseases, attempting to bring order to the bewildering array of human ailments. Sleepwalking, or asterisk somnambulismus, asterisk as it was often termed in the Latinate medical texts of the day to lend it an air of scholarly gravity, found its place within these intricate systems. It was frequently categorized under neuroses, a broad term encompassing diseases presumed to stem from disorders of the nerves, often listed alongside conditions such as hysteria, hypochondriasis, melancholia, and even certain forms of epilepsy, suggesting a perceived underlying link to some kind of nervous derangement, irritability, or fundamental instability. This wasn't necessarily mental illness in our modern, more specific understanding, but rather an indication that the delicate balance of the nerves, conceived perhaps as fine, taut strings or channels for vital fluids, was out of kilter, producing these strange manifestations. Perhaps your internal telegraph wires, to use a later analogy, were sending jumbled, unsynchronized messages, leading your body on these strange midnight errands while your conscious operator was sound asleep at the switch. One mainstream medical fact about the era is that treatments were often based on the principle of restoring this perceived nervous balance, or reharmonizing the humors if that was the favored theory. If a patient, such as yourself, was deemed too excitable, or their nerves too irritable, perhaps evidenced by their frequent and agitated nocturnal perambulations, then sedative measures might be prescribed. Laudanum, a tincture of opium mixed with alcohol, was a go-to remedy, a veritable panacea for a vast array of ailments from coughs and consumption to pain and anxiety. Its powerful calming and sleep-inducing properties would certainly have been thought beneficial for a restless sleepwalker. A nice, carefully measured, or perhaps not so carefully measured depending on the practitioner, dose of opium should theoretically keep you in bed, though it might come with a hefty side order of fairly epic, vivid, and potentially terrifying dreams of its own, not to mention the very real risk of dependence and addiction, dangers that were only slowly coming to be recognized. Conversely, if the sleepwalking was thought to stem from a torpid, sluggish, or melancholic state, perhaps a deficiency in vital spirit or an excess of black bile, then stimulants or invigorating tonics might be employed, though one shudders to think what a stimulated yet still unconscious sleepwalker might get up to. Try this invigorating elixir of cinchona bark and iron filings, sir, the doctor might cheerfully advise, and perhaps you'll only sleepwalk with brisk efficiency to the end of the street and back, instead of dawdling halfway to Bristol in your nightshirt. The concept of animal magnetism, popularized and sensationalized by Franz Anton Mesmer in the latter half of the 18th century, also cast a long, controversial shadow over discussions of mysterious conditions like sleepwalking. Mesmer proposed the existence of an invisible universal fluid, a sort of cosmic energy, that flowed through all living things. When this fluid became blocked or imbalanced within the body, he believed, it caused illness. His famous mesmeric crisis, an induced convulsive state often brought on in theatrical group sessions, was thought to restore the proper flow of this magnetic fluid and cure the patient. While mesmerism itself became quite controversial, often decried by the medical establishment as quackery, its ideas about invisible forces influencing the body and the potential for inducing trance-like states resonated deeply with the inherent mystery of sleepwalking. Some practitioners, particularly those leaning towards what we might now call alternative or complementary therapies, might have viewed sleepwalking as a spontaneous form of natural trance, a window into hidden sensitivities or even clairvoyant abilities, potentially holding clues to untapped knowledge or suppressed memories. It's like you're accidentally tuning into a cosmic radio station that only plays static and vague, mumbled instructions to rearrange the pantry or inspect the rose bushes. Medical men of the Georgian period often relied heavily on detailed case histories when they could get them, especially from literate and observant families or institutional settings. They would meticulously record the sleepwalker's age, sex, general temperament, sanguine, choleric, melancholic, or phlegmatic according to humoral theory, diet, daily habits, any preceding illnesses or significant life events, and of course the specific nature of their nocturnal activities. Did they speak? If so, was it coherent or gibberish? Did their eyes appear open or closed? Did they respond to external stimuli like sounds, light, or touch? Could they navigate familiar or unfamiliar obstacles successfully? Or did they blunder about? These observations, carefully noted down, were the raw data from which theories were painstakingly built, and treatments, often experimentally, were derived. One common thread in these case histories was the idea of a fixed idea or a dominant impression from the waking state being acted out during sleep. If you had been particularly worried about an unfinished task, had a strong emotional experience during the day, a fright, a deep sorrow, an intense joy, or had been engrossed in a particular train of thought before falling asleep, it was thought this might imprint itself on the sleeping mind and compel the body to enact it, like a play rehearsed in waking hours and performed unconsciously in the theater of the night. Historians still argue whether the medical focus on these fixed ideas was a genuine insight into the psychological triggers for some parasomnias, or simply a convenient way to make sense of otherwise inexplicable behavior within their existing intellectual frameworks. A way to impose a narrative on chaos. A quirky tidbit that often arises from the medical musings of the time is the intense debate over whether sleepwalkers felt pain or were impervious to it during their episodes. There were numerous anecdotal accounts of sleepwalkers sustaining quite significant injuries. Cuts from broken glass, deep bruises from falls, even burns from straying too close to a hearth. And apparently showing no immediate reaction, no cry of pain, no flinching, until they awoke sometime later, at which point they would experience the pain with full force. This phenomenon, if accurately reported, fueled theories about the dissociation of mind and body during somnambulism, suggesting that the sentient principle, the part of us that feels and consciously perceives, was somehow absent, suppressed, or disconnected from the physical body during these episodes. Other physicians, however, drawing on different observations, insisted that sleepwalkers did retain some level of sensation and would often avoid obviously painful stimuli or dangerous obstacles, indicating some residual awareness. You can imagine learned gentlemen in their studies, surrounded by leather-bound books and anatomical charts, poring over contradictory reports from worried parents, baffled spouses, or curious colleagues, trying to decide if a sleepwalker who stubbed their toe forcefully against a misplaced footstool really felt it at that moment, or if their subsequent yelp, if any, was merely an unconscious reflex, a bodily utterance devoid of true sensation. The patient vociferated loudly upon unexpected contact with the edge of the chamber pot, gentlemen, but was it an expression of true pain, one wonders, or merely an unconscious, albeit impressively loud objection to an unyielding ceramic impediment? Furthermore, the distinction between sleepwalking and other conditions that might involve altered consciousness or automatic behaviors wasn't always clear, given the limited diagnostic tools of the era. Epileptic seizures, particularly certain types of focal seizures, then often unrecognized as such, originating in specific parts of the brain, could involve complex automatic behaviors, a lack of awareness, and subsequent amnesia that might easily be confused with sleepwalking, especially in an era without EEGs to pinpoint the telltale electrical storms in the brain. Similarly, what we might now recognize as dissociative states or fugue states, though even less understood at the time, might also present with wandering, confusion, and a lack of memory for the event. The Georgian physician was, in many ways, working with a very blunt diagnostic toolkit, trying to differentiate between phenomena that looked quite similar on the surface, but might have very different underlying causes and prognoses. It's a bit like trying to fix a complex clockwork mechanism with only a large hammer and a hopeful prayer. Sometimes you might accidentally nudge something back into place, but mostly you just risk making a bigger, more complicated mess. So, as you move silently through your candleless world, a ghostly figure in your own home, you are now under the inquisitive and sometimes perplexed gaze of Georgian medical science, such as it was. No longer just a local curiosity or a family worry, you're potentially a case study. A syndrome to be classified according to the latest nosological system. A collection of fascinating symptoms to be treated with everything from gentle dietary advice, less roast beef and more calming barley water for you, young man, to potent narcotics like laudanum, or even more alarming practices like sudden cold water immersions designed to shock the system back to order. The mystery of your wanderings remained profound, but the attempts to unravel it were becoming more systematic, more rooted in careful observation and the emerging, if still somewhat clumsy, language of nerves, fluids, cerebral irritation, and physiological balance. Your midnight stroll is now not just a matter for hushed fireside gossip among the servants, but also a topic for sober discussion in the doctor's notebook, and perhaps even a point of debate at a medical society meeting. The cold from the flagstone floor of the kitchen you've unknowingly entered, or perhaps the rough-hewn wooden planks of a lesser-used hallway that leads to the servants' quarters, seeps insistently into the soles of your bare feet. This cold is a constant grounding reminder of your physical reality, even as your mind floats untethered in its own strange internal world. You're inside the relative confines of the house for now, but the Georgian home, as we've touched upon, was not the cocoon of regulated temperature and predictable safety that we know today. It was a place riddled with mundane, everyday perils, perils magnified tenfold or even 100-fold for someone navigating its shadowed spaces in a state of somnambulism. You might think your own house is out to get you when you stub your toe on the coffee table in the dark on the way to the bathroom, but a Georgian house for a sleepwalker played for keeps. It was an unyielding, unforgiving obstacle course. Let's start with the most obvious and perhaps most frequently encountered hazard: stairs. We've mentioned them before, but they bear repeating because they were such a significant and ubiquitous danger. Many Georgian staircases, especially in grander homes, were designed as architectural statements. Sweeping, elegant curves, often with highly polished wooden treads that could be incredibly slippery, especially to bare feet or soft-soled slippers. Crucially, these grand staircases sometimes lacked a continuous inner handrail for support, or featured widely spaced balusters, the vertical posts supporting the handrail, that a small child or a disoriented, unsteady adult could potentially slip through and fall to the hall below. Servants' stairs, often hidden away from the main parts of the house, were even more perilous. They were typically very narrow, incredibly steep, often winding sharply, poorly lit, if lit at all, even during the day, and usually constructed with less care and cheaper materials. A fall down any of these staircases, whether the grand main flight or the treacherous back stairs, could easily result in broken bones, severe sprains, a debilitating concussion, or worse, even proving fatal if the fall was from a significant height or if help was not quickly forthcoming. Imagine taking an unseen tumble in your thin linen nightshirt and lying there, injured and cold at the bottom of the stairs in the pitch darkness, perhaps unable to call for help, until discovered hours later when the first servants began to stir, if you were lucky. There's no emergency call button to press, no Alexa to shout at for assistance, no mobile phone to dial for help. Just the echoing silence of the vast sleeping house and the rapidly encroaching, bone-numbing chill. Then there are the hearths and fireplaces, the very heart of warmth in a Georgian home, but also a source of constant danger. In an era entirely reliant on open fires for heating the principal rooms, and for all cooking in the kitchen, nearly every important room, and certainly the kitchen with its massive cooking hearth, would have one. Even if the fire was carefully banked for the night, covered with ash to preserve the embers until morning, those dying embers could remain dangerously hot for many hours. A sleepwalker, drawn perhaps by a residual warmth or simply blundering in the dark, might stumble too close to the hearth. The long flowing fabric of their night clothes could easily catch a stray spark from an incompletely extinguished ember or brush against a hot iron fire dog. Or, in their disoriented state, they might even attempt to interact with the fire, perhaps trying to stoke it with a handy book found nearby, or attempting to rearrange still hot coals or logs with their bare hands, uncomprehending of the intense heat. The risk of severe burns was very real, and burns in an age before antibiotics and modern skin grafting techniques were often life-threatening or led to permanent disfigurement and disability. And forget smoke detectors or sprinkler systems. If your nightgown caught fire, your only alarm was the sudden, acrid smell of burning linen and then searing flesh, and by then, it was often far, far too late. The thought of a sleepwalker accidentally reigniting a banked fire and endangering the entire household, potentially burning the house down around their sleeping family, was a genuine and terrifying fear that must have haunted those living with a somnambulist. "Did you hear about poor Mrs. Higgins down the lane?" a neighbor might whisper over the garden fence. "Walked straight into the fender in her sleep, she did, and her nightdress went up like tinder." A dreadful, dreadful business. Windows, too, presented unique and often unappreciated dangers. We've touched on the general lack of safety bars or modern locking mechanisms. Georgian windows, particularly the elegant sash windows that were so characteristic of the architecture, could be heavy and cumbersome to operate. But also, if not properly secured or if the ropes were worn, could sometimes slide open unexpectedly or be opened by someone with an unthinking persistence. A sleepwalker, perhaps feeling too warm and stuffy in a closed room or dreaming of escape from some imagined pursuer, might manage to open one. Then, disoriented and unseeing, they might lean out too far into the cool night air, perilously close to the edge. In the multi-story townhouses that were becoming increasingly common in cities like London and Bath, this posed a truly lethal risk. Stories, though thankfully rare, did circulate in newspapers and whispered accounts about sleepwalkers falling from upper-story windows. It's a chilling thought. The deep silence of the night, then a sudden, inexplicable thud in the street, or the cobbled courtyard below, followed perhaps by a cry of alarm from a passing night watchman. One rather mainstream historical fact related to general household structure is the unevenness of floors in many older Georgian buildings, or even in less well-constructed new ones. Subsidence of foundations, the natural warping of timber over time, and simply less precise building methods meant that floors could sag noticeably, have loose or protruding floorboards, or feature unexpected small steps or changes in level between rooms or in long corridors. For a sighted person navigating in daylight, these were usually minor annoyances to be stepped over or around. For a sleepwalker adrift in darkness, they were insidious trip hazards, camouflage traps waiting to send them sprawling. The furniture itself, elegant and often prized, was another set of obstacles in the unlit domestic landscape. Georgian rooms, especially those of the well-to-do, could be quite cluttered by our modern minimalist standards, filled with an array of tables, card tables, tea tables, Pembroke tables, chairs of various designs, Hepplewhite, Sheraton, Chippendale, imposing cabinets and secretaires, decorative screens to ward off drafts, and a multitude of smaller decorative objects like vases, candelabra, and figurines. Think of all those delicate, spindle-legged chairs and tripod tables, so easily knocked over with a resounding crash in the silence. Heavy wardrobes or tall bookcases, if one were to blunder into them forcefully and repeatedly, could even pose a slight toppling risk, though that's perhaps a more dramatic and less common scenario. More commonly, it would be the constant accumulation of bruised shins from unseen table legs, stubbed toes against bedposts or door frames, and the nerve-jangling clatter of overturned ornaments or a dropped water ewer, loudly announcing the sleepwalker's erratic progress through the house to anyone whose sleep was not profound. "That dreadful racket I heard in the early hours, my dear?" a hostess might inquire of her house guest. "Oh, pray pay it no mind. That was just my dear husband, Father William, doing his usual nocturnal redecorating by Braille. He seems to have developed a particular affinity for rearranging the porcelain poodles this week. Broke another one, I believe, the third this month. What about tools or implements left lying about, not properly put away after the day's work?" In a busy Georgian kitchen, there would invariably be an array of sharp knives, heavy cleavers for jointing meat, sturdy skewers, and large weighty cast-iron pots and copper pans. In a scullery or wash-house, perhaps there would be heavy wooden buckets, mops leaning against a wall, or large wash-tubs still filled with cooling water from the day's laundry. A sleepwalker, their senses dulled or misdirected, might not perceive the imminent danger of a sharply honed blade left on a countertop, or the hazard of tripping over a bucket and falling into a tub of freezing, or even worse, scalding, if it was left from earlier cleaning tasks, water. Even in a seemingly innocuous drawing room or a gentleman's study, items like sharp-pointed letter openers, heavy glass or brass inkwells, or the set of iron fire tongs and poker leaning by the hearth could become inadvertent hazards if stumbled upon, picked up, or wielded in a confused, unconscious state. Historians and medical observers of the time often debated, and we still ponder today, whether sleepwalkers possess a kind of sixth sense, or an enhanced subconscious awareness that helps them avoid immediate danger, or if their often surprisingly adept navigation of familiar environments is simply due to deeply ingrained motor memory, a kind of autopilot based on countless repetitions of movement through those spaces during waking hours. The evidence from anecdotal accounts is decidedly mixed. Some sleepwalkers seem to perform astonishing feats of obstacle avoidance, gliding through cluttered rooms without disturbing a thing, while others seem to blunder into everything in their path, a trail of minor destruction in their wake. A quirky tidbit regarding potential household perils involves animal sleeping arrangements. Pets, particularly dogs, which were common in many Georgian households for companionship, hunting, or guarding, often slept indoors. They might be found curled up on a rug before the dying embers of a fire, on the floor near their owner's bed, or even, in some cases, in the bed itself. Tripping over a sleeping hound in the dark was a definite possibility, likely to result in a startled, painful yelp from the dog, a flurry of confused barking, and a potentially nasty fall for the unsuspecting sleepwalker. Or worse, a startled dog, suddenly awakened from its own dreams, might react defensively with a nip or a bite before recognizing the familiar figure. And then there were the less welcome nocturnal visitors we've previously mentioned. Mice skittering in the wainscoting, and perhaps rats in less salubrious dwellings or in the cellars and outbuildings. While not usually a direct physical threat in the same way as an unlit staircase, encountering one unexpectedly in the profound darkness, especially if you somehow trod on it, could be an experience. A very loud, sudden, squeaky experience, probably followed by more disoriented blundering and perhaps a shriek that would wake half the household. The very layout of many Georgian houses themselves could be labyrinthine and confusing, especially older properties that had been altered, extended, and added to over many generations, resulting in a patchwork of interconnected rooms, unexpected corridors, and odd little stairways. Unexpected turns, dead ends where a new wing had been awkwardly joined, sudden changes in floor level between one part of the house and another. All of these architectural quirks made navigation challenging even in broad daylight for someone unfamiliar with the house's eccentricities. For an unseeing resident, relying on a deeply memorized mental map of their surroundings, that map could still fail them if something was out of place. Doors might be left ajar that were usually kept firmly closed, or vice versa, leading to painful confusion, a bumped nose against an unyielding oak panel, or a tumble into an unexpectedly open room. And the simple, seemingly straightforward act of finding your way back to your own bed, once your nocturnal excursion had run its course, if it even had a conscious over before you were woken or simply collapsed from exhaustion, could be a significant challenge in itself. You might end up in the wrong room, curled up on a chaise longue in the drawing room, mistakenly in someone else's bed, leading to a very awkward morning discovery, or even collapse, utterly spent in a cold, drafty corridor, only to be found there shivering when the house began to stir. So, as you make your way, perhaps unconsciously drawn towards the faint, cool draft you sense seeping from under the ill-fitting back door that leads to the scullery yard, every shadow holds a potential unseen threat. Every familiar object is transformed into a possible hazard. The intrinsic comfort of home, that fundamental sense of it being a safe, predictable haven, is stripped away layer by layer when you are unable to consciously perceive, interpret, and react to your environment. Each creak of a floorboard under your weight, each silent piece of furniture standing sentinel in the gloom, each architectural feature from a grand staircase to a simple doorway becomes a part of an unlit, unforgiving obstacle course. And the prize for failing to navigate it successfully is not a gentle ribbing from amused family members, but the very real prospect of genuine physical harm, from minor bruises to life-altering injuries. It really does make one appreciate the humble invention of the nightlight, doesn't it? Or even the simple glow of a digital clock, a tiny beacon in our modern, less absolute darkness. The faint, cool draft you were drawn to, a subtle current of air in the otherwise still house, intensifies as you fumble with the latch of the scullery's back door. Perhaps it's a simple wooden bolt worn smooth with use that slides back with a dull thud. Or maybe it's a slightly more complex iron mechanism, a thumb latch that requires a specific pressure, or a rusty hinge that groans in protest. With the peculiar instinctual dexterity that sometimes bafflingly accompanies sleepwalking, you manage to open it. The familiar enclosed sounds of the house, the distant, solemn ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, the subtle sighing of ancient timbers settling, the occasional scurry of a mouse within the walls, are abruptly replaced by the entirely different sounds, smells, and sensations of the night outside. And if the perils lurking within the household were significant, the dangers awaiting a lone, unseeing sleepwalker on the unlit, largely unpoliced, and often unsanitary streets of Georgian Britain were an order of magnitude greater, a truly terrifying prospect. You've effectively left the relative safety, the known, if hazardous, territory of indoors, and stepped out into a world that is actively, if impersonally, hostile to the unwary, the unprotected, and the unconscious. Imagine the streets of a moderately sized Georgian town, or a bustling district of London at, say, 2 or 3 in the morning. As we've established, it's overwhelmingly, profoundly dark. If you happen to be in a more prosperous area of London, you might find the occasional, very dim, flickering oil street lamp, part of early piecemeal efforts at establishing some form of public lighting, usually paid for by local parish rates or wealthy residents. But these are few and far between, often poorly maintained, casting isolated dancing pools of murky, unreliable orange light that only serve to make the intervening stretches of darkness seem even more absolute and menacing. In smaller provincial towns or scattered villages, any form of public lighting would be practically non-existent, save perhaps for a lantern hung out by an inn that kept late hours, or the light spilling from the window of someone keeping a lonely vigil. The road surface beneath your bare feet, if you're fortunate enough to be on a paved street of rough cobblestones rather than a rutted, muddy track, would be uneven, treacherous, and often slick with a layer of accumulated filth. Remember what we said earlier about the disposal of chamber pots? Their contents, along with refuse from kitchens, vegetable peelings, animal bones, workshops, leather scraps, wood shavings, and stables, manure, soiled straw, were routinely dumped into the open gutters at the sides of the streets, or sometimes, with brazen disregard, straight into the middle of the thoroughfare. So, your first delightful sensory experience upon stepping outside might be your bare foot sinking into something cold, undeniably squishy, and profoundly unhygienic. Hope you remembered to have your imaginary tetanus shot before you embarked on this nocturnal adventure. The air itself, outside the confines of the house, would be thick with a potent, often pungent miasma of smells, a complex olfactory assault that would vary depending on the neighborhood and the prevailing wind. The ever-present aroma of coal smoke from countless domestic hearths and industrial furnaces, even in summer, from fires kept for cooking or lingering industrial processes, would mingle with the yeasty tang of breweries, the sharp chemical smell of tanneries, if you happen to wander into that less fragrant part of town, the unmistakable odor of open sewers or sluggish drainage channels carrying all manner of waste, and the general, all-pervading effluvia of a population living without the benefits of modern sanitation or regular refuse collection. This rich olfactory assault might be confusing or disorienting to a waking person, but it probably wouldn't wake you, our dedicated sleepwalker. You're on autopilot, and your autopilot doesn't seem to have a very keen or discerning sense of smell, apparently, or at least not one that registers disgust or alarm in the same way a conscious mind would. The quiet outside would also be different from the muffled indoor quiet. It would be punctuated by the distant metallic rumble of an early morning cart heading to market, the mournful howling of stray dogs scavenging in the alleyways, or perhaps less pleasantly, the sudden eruption of drunken shouts and coarse laughter from a late-night tavern or a disreputable gin den still disgorging its sodden clientele onto the unwelcoming streets. Navigational hazards would abound, far exceeding those within your own home. Open cellar entrances with rickety, ill-fitting wooden hatches, often left carelessly unlatched by tradesmen, could be an invisible trap in the darkness. Sudden, unexpected flights of stone steps leading down to basement dwellings or warehouses, unmarked and unlit, were common. Piles of building materials, bricks, timber, heaps of sand or rubble, might be left carelessly by the roadside by indifferent workmen, creating unseen obstacles. Roaming animals, particularly pigs, which were notorious urban scavengers in many towns, rooting through refuse heaps, could startle you or trip you. One particularly significant urban historical fact of the period was the kennel, the central drainage channel that often ran down the middle of many older, narrower streets. This was typically an open conduit designed to carry away rainwater and, unofficially but inevitably, a great deal of liquid waste. Stepping inadvertently into one of these kennels in the dark meant a nasty, jarring fall, an undignified soaking, and an unscheduled, very unpleasant bath in whatever foul liquid it contained. This was less a quiet walk in the park, and more an unexpected splash in the local sewer. And then there are the other human beings who might be out and about at such an ungodly hour. These are generally not your friendly neighborhood dog walkers or early morning joggers. You might encounter a few late-night revelers full of cheap gin or ale, staggering home arm in arm from the pub, who might react to your ghostly night-gowned figure with anything from loud, drunken amusement and mockery to suspicion or even outright aggression, especially if they felt startled or threatened by your silent, unresponsive approach. More menacingly, there were the ever-present footpads and ruffian street robbers, often desperate and armed with cudgels or knives, who preyed on nighttime travelers in the unlit streets. A lone figure dressed only in a nightdress or nightshirt, clearly disoriented and vulnerable, would look like an exceptionally easy and tempting target. They might not find much of monetary value on your person, unless you happen to sleepwalk with your purse, but the encounter itself could be terrifying, violent, and exceedingly dangerous. The idea that someone would even attempt to mug a sleepwalker seems almost darkly comedic from our vantage point, but crime was a serious and pervasive problem in Georgian cities, and desperation makes few distinctions. Your consciousness or your life probably wouldn't work as an effective threat when faced with someone whose consciousness was already, demonstrably, elsewhere. If you're particularly fortunate in your wanderings, you might encounter a member of the Night Watch, often affectionately, or more commonly derisively, known as Charlies, after King Charles II, during whose reign a more formalized, though still rudimentary, system of watchmen was established in London. These were men, frequently elderly, infirm, or otherwise deemed unfit for more strenuous or lucrative work, paid a mere pittance by the local parish to patrol the streets, equipped with a heavy coat, a lantern, and a staff or cudgel. Their duties included calling out the hour and the state of the weather, 2:30 and all's well in a cloudy night, and theoretically maintaining order, watching for fires, and apprehending miscreants. Though whether all was indeed well was often highly debatable, and their effectiveness was frequently questioned. A Charlie, dozing in his sentry box or slowly trudging his beat, encountering a sleepwalker like yourself, would likely be utterly baffled. Their primary concerns were apprehending thieves, dealing with public drunkenness, raising the alarm for fires, and generally trying to stay awake and out of trouble themselves. A well-dressed person, even if only in night attire, which might still be of good quality linen, wandering silently and aimlessly through the dark streets, apparently sober but completely unresponsive, didn't fit neatly into any of their usual categories of nighttime nuisances. Their reactions could vary considerably. A kindlier, more conscientious watchman might recognize the individual as someone from a nearby respectable house, and after failing to rouse them, attempt to gently guide them back home, perhaps knocking on the door to alert the sleeping household. A more officious, suspicious, or simply dull-witted one might roughly detain them, suspecting them of being drunk and disorderly, despite the lack of alcoholic fumes, certifiably mad and in need of restraint, or perhaps even a decoy for some nefarious gang of burglars operating nearby. Historians still debate whether the night watch system was a genuinely effective deterrent to crime, or more of a symbolic presence, a largely ineffectual relic of an older system. But for a lost, vulnerable sleepwalker adrift in the urban night, they represented one of the few potential, if highly unreliable, sources of assistance, or alternatively, a source of further complication, misunderstanding, and potential confinement in a cold, damp watchhouse cell until morning, when a magistrate could try to make sense of your strange predicament. Imagine trying to explain to a befuddled, half-asleep and probably grumpy Charlie, armed with a flickering lantern that casts long, dancing shadows and a very solid-looking staff, that you're not intoxicated, nor are you a vagrant or a lunatic, but are simply performing an unconscious and involuntary civic inspection of the local cobblestones and drainage systems. It would be a challenging conversation, even if you were awake to have it. A quirky tidbit about navigating Georgian urban nights. Because of the profound darkness and the often treacherous state of the streets, wealthy individuals who found themselves out late, perhaps returning from a society ball, a card party, or the theater, often employed link boys or linkmen to light their way home with flaming torches, links, made of tow and pitch. These link boys, often resourceful street urchins eager to earn a few pennies, would carry these smoking, sputtering torches ahead of their clients, illuminating the path and warding off some of the dangers of the night for a negotiated fee. A sleepwalker, of course, would have no such paid escort, no guiding flame to illuminate their path, making their solitary journey through the enveloping darkness all the more perilous, isolated, and uncertain. There's no Uber app with a somnambulist-friendly option available in 1780. You're entirely on your own, kid. A silent ship navigating a black ocean with no stars and no rudder. So there you are, out in the cold, dark streets. A solitary, fragile figure drifting through a hostile and indifferent environment. The cool, damp night air raises goosebumps on your skin. The strange, potent medley of unfamiliar urban smells fills your nostrils. Damp earth, rotting refuse, coal smoke, distant breweries. The hard, uneven, and often shockingly filthy ground beneath your bare feet sends strange, unheeded sensations upward. If you happen to be in a coastal town or near a river in a larger city, you might even unknowingly wander towards the docks or the quayside, with the added dangers of unseen drops into cold, dark harbor water, treacherous mooring ropes stretched across your path, stacked barrels and crates to blunder into, and the general rough and tumble, sometimes dangerous atmosphere of a working waterfront that could be active at any hour with the arrival or departure of ships. Every step you take is a gamble, every unseen corner a potential new peril. You're a ghost in your own life, haunting the pre-dawn city or the silent country lane, completely unaware of the myriad dangers that press in on you from all sides. The city, with its tightly packed buildings, its narrow, winding alleys and hidden courts, is a much more complex and potentially deadly maze than the relatively familiar, if still hazardous, confines of your own home. One wrong turn could lead you into a disreputable slum area known for its crime, down a dark, blind alley with no escape, or simply further and further away from safety, warmth, and the possibility of being found by your anxious family. Your quiet internal journey, dictated by the obscure whims of your sleeping mind, has suddenly become a very public and very, very risky expedition into the unknown. Let's say, for the sake of our continuing narrative, that your nocturnal ramble through those treacherous Georgian streets, or perhaps even just within the labyrinthine confines of your own large, drafty home, doesn't end merely with a stubbed toe, a collection of mysterious bruises, or a bewildered encounter with a Charlie from the night watch. What if, in your profoundly somnambulistic state, your actions had more serious consequences? What if you actually did something more significant? Not just walking about aimlessly, but an action that resulted in tangible harm or loss. Perhaps you unintentionally broke a valuable heirloom belonging to your host, inadvertently started a small fire by knocking over a candelabrum you were trying to interact with, or, in a more extreme and thankfully less likely scenario, even caused accidental harm to another person who tried to intervene or who simply got in your way. How did the Georgian legal system, a complex and often archaic construct of ancient common law precedent, parliamentary statutes, and the pronouncements of bewigged gentlemen judges with a deep fondness for impenetrable Latin phrases, even begin to grapple with the legal responsibility for actions committed by someone whose conscious mind was, by all appearances, entirely absent from the proceedings, lost somewhere in the land of Nod? This is where things get particularly murky, deeply fascinating, and land you, our hypothetical sleepwalking defendant, in a bewildering hypothetical courtroom scene of considerable confusion and debate. The concept of mens rea or guilty mind, a culpable mental state, has long been a fundamental cornerstone of English common law, which formed the robust basis of the Georgian legal system. For a crime to have been committed, generally speaking, there needed to be evidence of not only the wrongful act itself, the actus reus but also a blameworthy state of mind on the part of the accused. That is, an intention to commit the act, recklessness as to its consequences, or at least a conscious knowledge of wrongdoing. So, the immediate and central question for a Georgian court, if a sleepwalker's actions were ever brought before it in a criminal context, would be, could a person whose reason was demonstrably dormant, who was acting unconsciously, truly possess the requisite mens rea to be held criminally liable? It seems like a pretty open and shut case for no, of course not, from our modern perspective. But legal matters, especially when they intersect with poorly understood states of mind, are rarely that simple, particularly when dealing with phenomena that blurred the already fuzzy lines between medicine, perceived madness, individual eccentricities, and personal responsibility. Did the defendant, your lordship, intend with malice aforethought to pilfer the parson's prize-winning collection of prize tulip bulbs from his greenhouse? An exasperated barrister might argue. Or was he merely dreaming he was a very enthusiastic, albeit botanically challenged and unseasonably active giant badger? There certainly wasn't a specific parliamentary statute labeled the Sleepwalking Offenders Act of 1782 inches or any other year that explicitly addressed such situations. Instead, cases involving actions performed during sleep, if they reached a court, would have been filtered through existing legal categories and defenses, primarily those relating to concepts of insanity or a fundamental lack of legal capacity. The prevailing legal test for insanity in the Georgian era and for a significant part of the 19th century, until the Monotone rules were eventually established in 1843 following a famous case, was often quite crude and restrictive. It generally revolved around whether the accused was so profoundly deranged as to be completely unaware of the nature and quality of their act, or if they did know what they were doing, that they did not know it was wrong, often colloquially and rather brutally referred to as the wild beast test. Did the accused have less understanding than a wild animal? Did sleepwalking, a temporary and often episodic condition from which the person usually awoke with no memory and with their reason intact, fit this extreme and narrow definition of legal madness? Most learned jurists and physicians would probably argue no. You weren't chronically divorced from reality like a wild beast. You were just temporarily and inexplicably not quite at home upstairs while your body went for a stroll. However, the common law did recognize, to some extent, the possibility of states of non-insane automatism, where an act is committed unconsciously, not due to long-term insanity, but because of some other factor, perhaps an external one, like a severe blow to the head causing a concussion, or an internal one, like an epileptic seizure, or just possibly a profound state of sleepwalking. If it could be convincingly proven to the satisfaction of the court that the individual was genuinely in such an involuntary, unconscious state at the time of the alleged offense, it could potentially serve as a complete defense, leading to an acquittal. The immense challenge, of course, was proving it. How do you convince a skeptical jury of 12 ordinary men and a learned judge who might be more inclined to suspect simple feigning, drunkenness, or even malicious intent masked by a convenient excuse that you were truly, deeply, and verifiably asleep when you say, walked out of a provisioner's shop in the dead of night with a string of prize-winning sausages slung over your shoulder, for which you had clearly not paid? It's an exceptionally high bar for any defense attorney to meet, relying heavily on witness testimony about your state and perhaps prior history. Gentlemen of the jury, my client, Mr. Snodgrass, was not engaged in an act of premeditated sausage larceny. He was clearly under the somnambulistic impression that he was leading a parade of particularly plump, docile, and unusually edible dachshunds through the town square. An honest, if admittedly unusual and rather savory mistake. One important historical fact to remember is that the legal understanding and medical treatment of mental states were slowly and often unevenly evolving throughout the Georgian period. There was a growing, albeit very gradual, movement towards recognizing a wider spectrum of mental conditions and states of consciousness beyond the stark, binary opposition of sanity or insanity. Medical testimony, while not as formalized, rigorously evidence-based, or consistently influential as it is in modern courts, might be called upon in such cases. A respected local physician could potentially attest to a known pre-existing history of sleepwalking in the accused, or offer a learned opinion on whether the described actions were consistent with known patterns of somnambulistic behavior. However, the weight given to such expert testimony would vary enormously depending on the specific judge, the perceived credibility and social standing of the physician offering it, the eloquence, or lack thereof, of the barristers involved, and the prevailing general skepticism within the court and among the public about invisible mental states that could so easily be feigned. Historians who delve into the legal records of the period still argue whether Georgian courts were more likely to view proven sleepwalking as a form of temporary madness or incapacity, thus warranting some leniency or even an acquittal, or whether they might see it as a peculiar personal affliction or dangerous habit that didn't necessarily absolve the individual of all responsibility for their actions, especially if those actions were negligent, reckless, or if the danger was somehow foreseeable. For example, if someone with a known history of violent or destructive sleepwalking didn't take reasonable precautions to prevent harm. The outcome of any given hypothetical case would likely depend heavily on the precise facts presented, the social status and reputation of the accused, the skill and diligence of their legal representation, if they could afford any, and the general attitudes and biases of the local community, the jury, and the presiding court. There was no uniform, codified sleepwalker's defense that one could simply invoke. A quirky legal tidbit to consider: contract law, as well as criminal law, could also be complicated by proven instances of sleepwalking. What if, in a verified somnambulistic state, you apparently signed a legal document, agreed to the sale of your prize pig, or made a solemn witness promise to marry someone? Could such an agreement, entered into while your reasoning mind was effectively on an extended leave of absence, be held as legally binding? Generally, for any contract to be valid, there needs to be what the law terms asterisk consensus ad idem asterisk, a meeting of the minds, a genuine agreement between the parties involved. If one of the minds in question was effectively on vacation in the land of Nod, blissfully unaware of the transaction taking place, it's highly unlikely that a Georgian court, if the sleepwalking could be convincingly and credibly demonstrated, would uphold such a contract. Imagine the legal and financial chaos that would ensue if all your dream-based Amazon purchases or sleep-negotiated business deals were suddenly declared legally binding upon waking. We'd all be bankrupt several times over, proud owners of fleets of imaginary spaceships, talking animals, and bridges we didn't need. And what about civil wrongs, or torts, as we call them today in legal parlance? If your unconscious nocturnal activities resulted in accidental damage to someone else's property, say you sleepwalked into your neighbor's meticulously maintained prize-winning rose garden, and dreaming you were a Roman gladiator, proceeded to prune the bushes rather enthusiastically with a stick you found, could you be held civilly liable for the damages caused, even if you weren't deemed criminally culpable due to lack of intent? This is a somewhat grayer and more complex legal area. The law of torts, which deals with civil wrongs causing harm or loss, often focuses more on the harm actually caused and the fundamental principle of compensating the injured party for their loss, sometimes irrespective of the defendant's specific intent or mental state, particularly in cases of negligence or strict liability, though the latter was less developed then. So, while you might not go to the county jail for unconsciously knocking over your neighbor's prized and probably very expensive imported Ming vase, if they inexplicably kept it on their easily accessible front porch, you might still find yourself on the hook financially for its replacement cost, a debt that could be pursued through the civil courts. "My deepest apologies, Lord Ashworth," you might stammer upon being presented with the bill. "It appears my nocturnal self has unfortunately developed an expensive and rather clumsy taste in antique Chinese porcelain. Perhaps we can arrange a payment plan?" Ultimately, the Georgian legal system, when confronted with the rare and perplexing cases involving actions allegedly committed during sleepwalking, was likely to approach them with a characteristic mixture of ingrained legal tradition, cautious pragmatism, a degree of societal bewilderment, and a healthy dose of innate skepticism. There was no clear, predefined roadmap for judges or juries to follow. Each case, had it arisen, would have presented a unique and difficult challenge testing the very boundaries of established legal definitions of consciousness, volition, criminal intent, and personal responsibility. For you, our hypothetical sleepwalking litigant, your fate in the somber, wood-paneled courtroom would be as uncertain and unpredictable as your own nighttime wanderings through the darkened house. You would be, in essence, at the mercy of a legal system trying to apply old, often inflexible rules to a very strange, new, in terms of legal consideration, set of circumstances, all while hoping that the venerable scales of justice wouldn't tip too unkindly or too illogically against someone whose only real crime was to take their most vivid and active dreams for an unscheduled walk. Your silent, unseeing, and often solitary passage through the deeply darkened house or the occasionally moonlit street isn't just a private family drama, a local curiosity, or a confounding matter for sober-faced physicians and bewigged jurists to ponder. As general fascination with the intricate workings of the human mind, its normal functions, and its strange aberrations grew steadily throughout the Georgian period, the enigmatic figure of the sleepwalker began to tiptoe, quite literally and metaphorically, onto the stages of London's theaters, and into the pages of popular literature. Theatrical performances, especially the burgeoning melodramas, and the increasingly popular genre of the Gothic novel found in the phenomenon of somnambulism a wonderfully evocative and versatile trope. It was perfect for creating an atmosphere of suspense and mystery, for exploring those shadowy liminal states between reason and madness, the conscious and the unconscious, the natural and the potentially supernatural. You, in your nightly, unremembered wanderings, are unwittingly becoming a recognizable character type, a figure of both fascination and fear in the cultural imagination of the era. On the Georgian stage, often lit by flickering candles or slightly brighter, though still somewhat unreliable, oil lamps, sleepwalking scenes became a powerful and frequently employed dramatic device. Think, of course, of Lady Macbeth from Shakespeare's tragedy. Though she predates the Georgian era by more than a century, her chilling, guilt-ridden nocturnal confessions, "Out, damn spot, out I say," witnessed with awe and horror by the concerned doctor and the anxious gentlewoman, provided an enduring and highly influential template for countless imitations and variations in later plays. The potent image of a central character, often a distressed heroine, gliding silently across the stage in a flowing white nightdress, her eyes wide and vacant, muttering disjointed fragments of past traumas, hidden secrets, or guilty knowledge, was theatrical gold. It allowed playwrights a direct and dramatic means to reveal a character's innermost turmoil, to foreshadow future tragic events, or to create moments of intense pathos, chilling suspense, or outright horror for the captivated audience. The theatergoers, already primed by their own cultural understanding of the profound darkness and mystery of the night, and perhaps by whispered family tales of similar occurrences, would be held spellbound by such a spectacle. It's far more dramatically engaging and visually arresting than someone merely tossing and turning in bed and shouting out incomprehensible phrases in their sleep. Is that a dagger I see before me? It's handled toward my hand? A tragic hero might muse, sleepwalking. Or did I just forget to put my spectacles on before embarking upon my midnight ramble to inspect the wine cellar? These stage sleepwalkers, it must be said, often performed quite elaborate and highly convenient actions while supposedly in their trance. They might be seen writing incriminating letters that invariably revealed a dastardly villain or exonerated an innocent hero, hiding crucial objects like wills or daggers in easily discoverable places, or dramatically reenacting key moments from the play's central plot, often providing clues that the more conscious characters had somehow missed. This was, of course, theatrical license, a significant heightening of reality for dramatic effect. While real-life sleepwalkers like yourself might be found attempting to butter the hearth brush with a poker, or inexplicably folding the bed linens into complex origami shapes, stage sleepwalkers were invariably busy resolving convoluted plot lines, often with a surprising and dramatically convenient lucidity and purposefulness within their apparent trance. This theatrical portrayal, while not always or even often medically or experientially accurate, certainly embedded the vivid image of the highly capable, articulate, if unconsciously driven sleepwalker deeply into the popular imagination of the Georgian public. One important historical fact contributing to this trend was the notable rise of melodrama as a dominant theatrical form in the later Georgian and early Victorian periods. Sleepwalking scenes, with their inherent visual drama, their capacity for generating tension and revealing hidden emotions, were a perfect fit for this genre, which relied heavily on heightened emotion, clear-cut distinctions between good and evil, and sensational, often improbable situations designed to thrill and move the audience. The Gothic novel, a genre which truly came into its own and flourished spectacularly during the Georgian era, with pioneering authors like Horace Walpole, *The Castle of Otranto*, Anne Radcliffe, *The Mysteries of Udolpho*, and Matthew Monk Lewis, *The Monk*, seized upon the idea of sleepwalking with particular relish and used it to great atmospheric effect. These chilling tales, often set in decaying, isolated castles, spooky, ruined abbeys, remote, unfamiliar manor houses, not entirely unlike the one you yourself might be wandering through in your nightly drama, and dark, threatening forests, thrived on creating an atmosphere of pervasive gloom, brooding mystery, and the constant suggestion of the supernatural. What could be more quintessentially Gothic than a pale, ethereal heroine, dressed in diaphanous white, drifting like a phantom through moonlit, cobweb-draped, ruined corridors, her somnambulistic actions hinting at dark family secrets, long-forgotten crimes, or the unseen, baleful presences of restless spirits? Sleepwalking in these popular novels often served to skillfully blur the lines between genuine psychological disturbance rooted in trauma or sensibility and actual ghostly encounters or supernatural influence. Is the sleepwalking heroine merely deeply troubled by her circumstances, her mind seeking an unconscious escape? Or is she perhaps being mysteriously guided or even possessed by the restless spirit of a murdered ancestor seeking justice or revealing a hidden treasure? The delicious ambiguity was, of course, a significant part of the thrill for the eager readers. The sleepwalking character in Georgian literature, whether on stage or in a novel, often became a potent symbol of innocence imperiled, of purity threatened by dark forces, or of a delicate psyche fractured by unbearable trauma or suppressed guilt. They were frequently portrayed as inherently vulnerable, their unconscious state making them susceptible to the machinations of insidious villains, or inadvertently leading them into dangerous physical situations from which they would, inevitably, need to be rescued by a brave hero or a loyal friend. Sometimes their apparently aimless nocturnal wanderings would, with remarkable and convenient narrative timing, lead them to discover a vital clue essential to resolving the plot. A hidden secret passage behind a tapestry, an incriminating letter tucked into a dusty tome, or even a forgotten skeleton walled up in a dark, unused closet, sometimes quite literally. It's as if their unconscious mind possessed a superior detective sense, a hidden wisdom or intuition that their waking, rational self lacked. "Don't mind me, good sirs," the sleepwalking heroine might seem to imply as she drifts past, "just following my subconscious breadcrumbs quite by accident to the dastardly villain's secret lair, all while comfortably attired in my pajamas and slippers, of course." Historians of literature and culture still debate the extent to which these literary and theatrical portrayals of sleepwalkers significantly shaped actual public perception, and even perhaps influenced medical understanding or misunderstanding of the condition, versus the idea that literature merely reflected and amplified pre-existing societal anxieties, folk beliefs, and general curiosities about such strange behaviors. It's most likely a complex interplay of both, a dynamic feedback loop where dramatic, often sensationalized representations highlighted and sometimes exaggerated certain aspects of sleepwalking, which then, in turn, influenced how ordinary people interpreted and reacted to real-life occurrences they witnessed or heard about. If all you knew of sleepwalking was derived from a thrilling melodrama you'd seen at the Drury Lane Theater, you might well expect your own sleepwalking Aunt Maud to be rather more prone to dramatic revelateur monologues and precise, goal-oriented actions than she actually was when found simply trying to water the potted plants with the milk jug. A quirky literary tidbit to consider. Sometimes the sleepwalking depicted in these novels or plays was, in a clever plot twist, eventually revealed to be a deliberate deception, a carefully orchestrated performance. A cunning character, perhaps a resourceful heroine or a devious villain, might feign sleepwalking in order to spy on others undetected, to gain access to a forbidden room or a locked strongbox, or to create a seemingly unshakable alibi for their whereabouts during a critical time. This element of potential trickery and performance added another layer of intrigue and suspicion to the trope. Was the pale, drifting figure truly unconscious and unaware, a helpless puppet of their sleeping mind? Or were they, in fact, a cunning actor, fully aware and exploiting the perception of somnambulism for their own ends? This element of possible imposture reflected a genuine real-world skepticism that sometimes surrounded authentic cases of somnambulism, adding to the difficulty of discerning truth from fiction, both in literature and in life. It's certainly a handy plot device if you need a character to be somewhere they shouldn't logically be, or to overhear something crucial without them being held strictly responsible for their presence. Or so they, and the author, would like the audience to believe. Beyond the more formal productions of the stage and the pages of the bound novel, accounts of particularly sensational or inexplicable sleepwalking cases would sometimes appear in the rapidly proliferating newspapers, popular magazines, or ephemeral pamphlets of the day. These tales, often embellished for maximum dramatic effect and reader appeal, might detail individuals performing truly extraordinary and often death-defying feats while apparently sound asleep, climbing dangerous precipices or the sheer walls of buildings, swimming across treacherous, fast-flowing rivers in the dead of night, or even composing complex musical pieces or lengthy poems only to awaken with no memory of their prodigious achievements. Such accounts, hovering uncertainly in the territory between documented fact and lurid fiction, contributed significantly to the almost mythic, legendary status of the sleepwalker in the popular consciousness. You're no longer just plain John or Jane Doe from next door who occasionally walks in their sleep. You're potentially the astonishing somnambulist of Somerset, a figure of wonder and awe, seemingly capable of anything while under the mysterious, powerful spell of sleep. So, as you continue your own quiet, unremembered, and entirely unscripted journey through the deep silence of your Georgian abode, You are unaware that you are, in a cultural sense, unconsciously auditioning for a role that is becoming increasingly popular and well-defined in the collective imagination of the era. Your unseeing movements, your characteristic vacant stare, your occasionally muttered fragments of disjointed speech, if you speak at all becoming recognizable components of a familiar archetype. The hidden terrors and peculiar mysteries of your own inner world are, through these cultural representations, being externalized, dramatized, interpreted, and eagerly consumed by a public hungry for thrills, for tantalizing glimpses into the shadowy, largely unexplored recesses of the human mind, and for stories that danced provocatively on the very edge of the rational and the explicable. You are entertainment in a peculiar public way, though thankfully you remain blissfully unaware of the critical reviews or the box office receipts. Your slow, methodical, and perhaps entirely pointless fumbling with disparate objects in the utterly darkened scullery. Perhaps you're carefully rearranging the collection of pewter mugs on the dresser, or inexplicably attempting to polish a dusty root vegetable with a dishcloth, becomes, in its own way, symbolic of the Georgian era's often clumsy, sometimes desperate, and occasionally downright bizarre attempts to find a cure, or at least an effective way to manage the perplexing phenomenon of sleepwalking. While learned physicians in their London consulting rooms debated the intricacies of humors and the state of the nervous system, and while playwrights in their garrets penned increasingly dramatic somnambulistic scenes for the stage, everyday people in ordinary households, as well as some medical practitioners operating on the fringes of accepted practice, were trying all sorts of strange concoctions, traditional practices, and inventive remedies to keep their beloved nocturnal wanderers safely tucked in their beds until morning. If your family was at their absolute wit's end with your nightly constitution-testing jaunts around the house and grounds, they might well turn in desperation to some of the rather peculiar and often highly dubious remedies that were popularly recommended at the time. Many of these balms, potions, and cures were rooted in the same fertile soil as the folkloric beliefs and superstitions we explored earlier, often blending ancient superstition with traditional herbalism, a dose of Galenic medical theory, and a very healthy dollop of pure wishful thinking. If sleepwalking was widely seen in some quarters as a fundamental disturbance of the spirit, a sort of psychic restlessness, then treatments might logically aim to soothe, protect, or re-anchor that wayward spirit. Herbal remedies were, of course, incredibly common, and formed the backbone of medical practice for most ailments. Infusions or tinctures of valerian root, a plant known for its notable sedative properties even today, might be administered nightly. Hops, gathered from the hedgerows or cultivated in cottage gardens and known for their sleep-inducing qualities, often experienced by those working in hop fields, might be sewn into a pillow. Lavender, with its calming scent, might be strewn amongst the bed linens or drunk as a tea. Chamomile, another gentle relaxant, would certainly be tried. Anything believed by tradition or local reputation to promote calm, ward off ill dreams, and encourage deep, restful, and importantly, immobile sleep would be pressed into service. You might, therefore, be made to drink a nightly cup of some murky, bitter-tasting brew that smelt faintly of old socks, damp earth, and very hopeful wishes, all in the noble name of keeping your roaming feet still and your body bed-bound until the cockerel crowed. Another delicious, steaming mug of poppyhead and beetle-wing tea, dear Bartholomew, your anxious mother might coax. It's brewed with extra special care tonight. Drink it all down now. It's sure to keep those troublesome wandering feet of yours still and peaceful tonight, just you see. Then there were the more assertive and often less pleasant interventions. One pervasive historical fact regarding Georgian medical practice is the continued and often enthusiastic use of powerful purgatives, laxatives, and emetics, substances that induce vomiting, as a kind of general panacea for a wide range of conditions. The underlying theory, if one could generously call it that, was the necessity of cleansing the body of whatever ill humors, noxious vapors, or undigested peccant matter might be causing the disturbance, thus restoring internal balance. So, if you were a known sleepwalker, you might well be subjected to regular doses of foul-tasting, gut-wrenching concoctions. Perhaps senna, jalap, or even more potent substances like calomel, mercurous chloride, designed to vigorously empty your system from one end or the other, or preferably from both simultaneously for maximum cleansing effect. The rather brutal logic seems to have been that if you're busy being violently and exhaustingly ill, you're far less likely to have the energy, inclination, or indeed the physical capacity for a midnight stroll around the house or garden. It's a rather aggressive and decidedly unpleasant form of sleep therapy, and probably made everyone involved, the patient and the caregiver alike, thoroughly miserable for a considerable time. Dietary restrictions were also commonly prescribed and widely believed to be effective. Remember that perennial culinary suspect cheese, especially strong, rich, or indigestible varieties? It, along with other heavy or difficult-to-digest foods like rich, fatty meats, especially pork, highly spiced or seasoned dishes, certain windy vegetables like cabbage or beans, and perhaps late-night suppers in general, might be banished entirely from the sleepwalker's evening meal, or even their entire diet. The prevailing idea was that a tumultuous, fermenting gut inevitably led to a disturbed, agitated mind and, as a direct consequence, to wandering feet in the night. You might, therefore, be condemned to a depressingly bland and repetitive diet of thin gruel, weak broth, dry toast, and perhaps some watery boiled vegetables, which, frankly, might be enough to make anyone want to walk out in their sleep, if only to forage for some decent, flavorful food in the pantry. No, no, my dear Bartholomew, your father might firmly declare at the dinner table, you absolutely cannot have that delicious-looking slice of cold pork pie. It's straight to the plain boiled cabbage and a crust of bread for you tonight, my restless lad. We must calm those nocturnal agitations. Physical interventions, sometimes quite harsh, were also a prominent feature in the therapeutic landscape. Cold baths, or simply dousing the sleepwalker with buckets of cold water, were sometimes recommended by physicians and widely practiced by families. This could be done either upon discovering the sleepwalker mid-ramble, as a means of shocking them awake, or even more distressingly, as a preventative measure before bed, in the hope of toning the nerves or jolting the system into a more ordered and less peripatetic state of sleep. Imagine being rudely and shockingly awakened from your somnambulistic reverie, or even from a normal deep sleep, by a sudden, heart-stopping cascade of icy water. It would certainly get your attention with an unwelcome jolt, and probably give you a nasty lingering cold and a deep-seated resentment into the bargain. Historians and medical ethicists still argue whether such harsh, sometimes punitive-seeming methods were born more out of a genuine, if misguided, belief in their therapeutic efficacy, or simply out of sheer desperation, frustration, and fear on the part of overwhelmed caregivers. And now we venture into the realm of the truly bizarre, where folk medicine blends seamlessly with overt magic. Some of the advocated cures for sleepwalking bordered on the ludicrously magical or the outright nonsensical, vividly reflecting the tenacious, lingering influence of deep-rooted superstition, even in an age that prided itself on its burgeoning rationality. A quirky tidbit that occasionally surfaces in folkloric collections and old household remedy books. There are scattered, sometimes whispered references to supposed remedies, such as tying a live toad, preferably a warty one for extra potency, in a small muslin bag around the unfortunate sleepwalker's neck. The precise logic there is delightfully, wonderfully obscure. Perhaps the cold, damp toad was thought to absorb the wandering spirit or the excess heat believed to cause the restlessness? Or making the sleepwalker wear stockings that had been filled with certain specific herbs. Mugwort was a common one associated with dreams and other worldly journeys, or even, in some particularly grim folk traditions, with a handful of soil taken from a fresh grave in the local churchyard, the idea presumably being to keep them grounded, one presumes, in a rather morbid and unhygienic fashion. You might also be instructed by a local wise woman or a traveling quack to sleep with your head pointing in a particular auspicious compass direction, often north, or to have specific objects with protective qualities placed around your bed. Iron, for example, was widely thought to ward off uncanny influences and evil spirits, so perhaps a few strategically placed old horseshoes or a rusty iron poker under the mattress. One certainly hopes that the prescribed toad wasn't a particularly active or vociferous one. That would just add insult and a distinct lack of sleep for other reasons to the already considerable injury of the cure. Furthermore, the use of amulets, talismans, and charms might be employed as a frontline defense or a last resort. A special prayer, meticulously written out on a small piece of clean parchment and then carefully sewn into the hem of your nightclothes, might be considered efficacious. A particular gemstone, perhaps an amethyst for tranquility, or a carnelian for courage, though what courage the sleepwalker needed was unclear, might be worn on a cord around the neck. A small sachet filled with a specific blend of protective herbs like rosemary for remembrance, of staying in bed presumably, and rue for repelling negativity, could be tucked under your pillow. The powerful influence of the placebo effect and the deep human need for reassurance and a sense of agency cannot be entirely discounted here. If someone truly and fervently believed that a particular charm or ritual would keep them safely in their bed, then perhaps, in some cases, it actually did, or at least reduced the frequency or severity of the episodes. Or perhaps it just made their anxious family feel a little bit better, a little more in control because they were actively doing something, anything, to combat this unsettling nocturnal affliction. It's also worth noting that some so-called treatments were less about attempting a genuine cure for the underlying sleepwalking, and more about simply managing the physical manifestations of the sleepwalker, keeping them contained. This bleeds somewhat into our next section on practical household management, but methods such as physically tying a person, gently or not so gently, to their bed with ropes or strong cloth bands, or ensuring that all bedroom doors and windows were securely locked and bolted from the outside, were eminently practical, if rather restrictive and sometimes frightening measures. Some of these were born of simple common sense and a desire to protect. Others were quite drastic and indicative of the level of fear involved. The line between a formal medical prescription from a university-educated physician and a traditional folk remedy suggested by an elderly village woman was often very blurry and permeable in the Georgian era, especially outside of the major urban centers. A respected physician might conscientiously recommend a particular bland diet and a calming herbal tincture he had learned about, while also not actively discouraging a desperate family from, say, religiously placing a wide, shallow basin of cold water beside the bed each night. A common enough folk belief being that a sleepwalker, even in their trance, would instinctively recoil from stepping into cold water and thus be awakened. Many doctors, while perhaps privately skeptical of some of the more outlandish folk cures and charms their patients might espouse, were pragmatic enough to know that families needed to feel they were taking all possible actions and often needed the comfort of familiar traditions. Yes, yes, Mrs. Smith, the doctor might say with a reassuring nod. The laudanum mixture I've prescribed is, of course, essential for calming the nerves, but by all means, do continue with the toad in the bag around young Master Timothy's neck if you feel it helps. Can't hurt, one supposes, might possibly help through some unknown means, and at least it provides some rather quiet, if knobbly, company for the lad during his nightly vigils. So, as you drift silently and unconsciously through the profound darkness of your home, your physical system might well be a complex, unacknowledged cocktail of various herbal sedatives ingested earlier in the evening, perhaps the lingering after effects of a recently administered purgative that left you feeling weak and empty, or maybe just the blandness of a rigorously prescribed anti-somnambulism diet that offers little comfort or joy. You might, if you were awake to notice, detect a faint lingering aroma of dried lavender, valerian root, and a certain underlying scent of anxious desperation clinging to your person and your bedclothes. The myriad attempts to somehow anchor your restless spirit and body firmly to your bed were numerous, wonderfully varied, often deeply imaginative, and regrettably, frequently based more on entrenched hope, ancient tradition, and sheer desperation than on any real, evidence-based understanding of what precisely made you and others like you wander so persistently and so strangely in the deep silence of the night. These bizarre balms, peculiar practices, and sometimes alarming procedures stand as a vivid testament to human ingenuity and occasionally to enduring human foolishness and credulity in the ongoing struggle to confront and comprehend the unknown. The strange herbal balms, the potent purgatives, and the peculiar dietary concoctions might have been aimed at achieving some kind of internal cure for your wandering ways. But what about the immediate, pressing, practical problem of you, dear sleepwalker, actually physically getting up out of your bed and potentially coming to serious harm or causing significant chaos within the sleeping household? Georgian families and households faced with the unsettling reality of a nocturnal wanderer in their midst. Whether a young child, an adolescent, or even a respected adult member, developed and employed a wide range of day-to-day, or rather night-to-night strategies to cope. Some of these were eminently sensible and born of loving concern. Others were rather restrictive, even bordering on the imprisoning. And all of them vividly reflected the deep, constant concern, and sometimes the utter exasperation and fatigue, that a habitual sleepwalker could provoke in those who lived with and cared for them. The focus here shifts from attempting to fix your mysterious inner workings to simply trying to manage and contain your outer wanderings, a task which often involved a great deal of anxious, nerve-wracking vigilance and lost sleep on the part of your loved ones or dedicated servants. The most straightforward and commonly adopted methods involved attempting to secure the immediate environment around the sleepwalker. Locking bedroom doors securely from the outside was a common, if rather blunt and potentially hazardous approach. This, of course, effectively turned the sleepwalker's bedroom into a temporary cell for the night, which might prevent wandering but would also not be ideal if, for example, a fire broke out in the house and a quick escape was necessary, or if the sleepwalker themselves became ill or distressed during the night and needed assistance. But for a family terrified of a young child or a vulnerable relative wandering out into the cold, dark street, falling down a treacherous flight of stairs or coming to some other harm, it might well have seemed the lesser of two evils, a difficult but necessary precaution. Windows, too, would be carefully and securely fastened, perhaps with extra bolts or catches, or even, in extreme and persistent cases, nailed firmly shut. especially if the sleepwalker had previously shown a disconcerting tendency to try and open them, perhaps in an attempt to enact a dream of flying or escaping. It's a bit like modern-day baby-proofing of a house, but far more robust and designed for an unconscious and often surprisingly strong and dexterous adult or older child with a mysterious and unpredictable nightly agenda. You might find your determined, unconscious late-night escape to the pantry to commune with the cheese, or your trek to the library to rearrange the encyclopedias, effectively foiled by a newly installed and very sturdy iron bolt on your bedroom door that your sleeping fingers just can't manage to operate. More direct physical restraints were also employed, though their nature, their severity, and the frequency of their use undoubtedly varied greatly, depending on the family's means, their level of desperation, and the perceived danger posed by the sleepwalker's activities. We touched briefly on the gentle idea of tying a soft string from the sleepwalker's wrist to that of a caregiver sleeping nearby, a relatively mild form of alarm system designed to rouse the watcher. More robustly, and certainly more distressingly, an arm or a leg of the sleepwalker might be tied with rope or strong strips of cloth directly to the heavy bedpost or the bed frame itself. This sounds incredibly harsh to our modern sensibilities, and undoubtedly it was a deeply unpleasant and confining experience, but it usually came from a place of profound anxiety and a desperate desire to prevent more serious injury that could result from unrestrained wandering. The image is not a pleasant one to contemplate. You, tethered like a restless, unhappy pony in its stall, straining unconsciously, perhaps fruitlessly, against your bonds throughout the long night. It speaks volumes about the intense anxieties and the very real dangers involved in caring for a habitual sleepwalker in that era. One mainstream historical fact is the existence and use of crib beds or high-sided cot beds, not just for containing infants and very young children, but sometimes adapted or specifically built for older children or even adults with certain physical or mental conditions that made them prone to falling out of bed or wandering off unsupervised. If you were a known and persistent sleepwalker, particularly as a child or a vulnerable adult, you might find yourself unceremoniously relegated back to sleeping in what amounted to a giant barred playpen for your own safety. The old basin of cold water placed strategically by the bed trick was remarkably widespread and frequently recommended in household advice books and by word of mouth. The prevailing theory was that the sudden, unexpected shock of stepping barefoot into a wide, shallow pan of icy cold water would instantly and effectively wake the sleepwalker, halting their progress before they even got properly started. Whether this simple method worked consistently is highly debatable. You might just end up with very cold, wet feet and unfazed, continue on your merry, somnambulistic way, leaving a telltale damp trail of footprints across the floorboards. Or you might indeed wake up suddenly, spluttering, shivering, and profoundly furious at the rude awakening which might not endear you to your well-meaning but perhaps overzealous would-be protectors. Still, it was a relatively harmless, inexpensive, and widely recommended tactic, one that families could easily implement themselves. Some resourceful families also laid down other types of obstacles around the bed. Perhaps a length of crinkly, noisy material like dried straw or stiff paper that would make a rustling sound if stepped on, thereby alerting a light sleeper. Or even, though this sounds rather deliberately cruel, something specifically designed to be uncomfortable or mildly painful to tread on, like a tray filled with rough gravel, sharp-edged shells, or even, as one account suggests, upturned thistles, in the desperate hope of deterring those first few unconscious steps out of bed. "Oh, bother and drat," you might exclaim, if you were awake enough to register it. "Not the nocturnal gravel pit of despair again. My poor feet." Beyond these more physical or mechanical measures of containment, there was the crucial human element, the often exhausting and thankless family vigil. If a particular member of the household was known to sleepwalk regularly and persistently, other family members, a spouse, a parent, an older sibling, or perhaps in wealthier households, a dedicated servant or a hired night nurse, would often take turns staying awake all night, or at least sleeping very lightly, their ears constantly strained and listening intently for any suspicious sound of movement from the sleepwalker's room. This was an incredibly tiring, stressful, and thankless task, often stretching on for weeks, months, or even years. Imagine the constant underlying state of low-level anxiety, the perpetual readiness, the ear hyper-attuned for the slightest, almost imperceptible creak of a distant floorboard, the soft click of a door latch being cautiously lifted, or the muffled sound of bare feet padding softly along a hallway. Profound sleep deprivation for the designated caregiver or watcher was a very real and debilitating consequence of living with a habitual sleepwalker. Their nights would be fragmented and punctuated by your silent, unpredictable sorties from bed, and their days would consequently be marked by overwhelming fatigue, irritability, and a gnawing, persistent worry. The cumulative emotional toll on families caring for a sleepwalker could be immense and multifaceted. There was the ever-present overriding fear for the sleepwalker's physical safety, of course, the dread of discovering them injured or worse. But there could also be deep frustration, mounting irritation, and sometimes even resentment, especially if the sleepwalking episodes were very frequent, highly disruptive to the entire household's rest, or involved destructive or dangerous behaviors. If the sleepwalker became agitated, confused, or even aggressive when attempts were made to rouse them or guide them back to bed, which can sometimes happen as they are in a dissociated state between sleep and wakefulness, it could be genuinely frightening and upsetting for those trying to help. And then, woven through all of this, there was the pervasive social stigma we've discussed previously. A family might try desperately to keep the sleepwalking a closely guarded secret, especially if it involved an adult member whose reputation or social standing could be affected, to avoid malicious gossip, ridicule, or harsh judgment from neighbors, acquaintances, or even other relatives. This secrecy, born of shame or fear, could lead to a profound sense of isolation and burden for the entire household, cutting them off from potential support or understanding. Historians who study family life and social attitudes in the period still argue about the extent to which families openly sought medical or communal help for conditions like sleepwalking versus their tendency to try and manage it as discreetly as possible within the private confines of the home. However, the social pressures to maintain a facade of normalcy and avoid any hint of peculiarity or affliction were undoubtedly very strong in Georgian society. A quirky tidbit often found in advice literature from the period regarding the household management of sleepwalkers involves sincere attempts to gently guide them back to safety rather than trying to wake them abruptly. Some physicians and many lay people believed that waking a sleepwalker suddenly, especially if they were in a deep trance, could be dangerous to their physical health, perhaps causing a shock to the system, or even detrimental to their sanity, a belief that still has some residual currency today, though the actual danger of waking a sleepwalker is often overstated. It's more likely to be just disorienting and distressing for them. So, a concerned caregiver, upon discovering you on one of your nocturnal expeditions, might try to gently take your arm and steer you softly back towards your bed without actually rousing you fully from your somnambulistic state. They might speak to you in very low, calm, soothing tones, using simple, reassuring phrases, essentially becoming a quiet, almost invisible accomplice in the last act of your nightly unconscious drama, their main goal being to ensure that it concluded safely and without incident back under the warm covers of your own bed. "That's right, my dear, just this way," a mother might whisper, gently guiding her sleepwalking child. "Time to lead the imaginary sheep back into their imaginary pen now. And look, the pen is conveniently located right here in your own warm bedroom. Well done." For the families of Georgian sleepwalkers, the task of protecting their wandering loved one was an ongoing, often wearying, and emotionally draining responsibility. They were the first, and often the only, line of defense against the myriad perils of the unlit night. They were the ones whose sleep was lightest, whose ears first detected those faint initial stirrings from the next room. They were the ones who would rush, heart-pounding, to check the bolt on the bedroom door, or who would patiently and gently, or sometimes in their fear and frustration not so gently, try to coax or maneuver the oblivious wanderer back to the safety of their bed. Their tireless efforts, their nightly vigils, and their often inventive precautions were usually born of deep love, a strong sense of familial duty, and, frequently, a profound and bewildered lack of any real understanding of what they were dealing with. They were armed only with scraps of folk wisdom, perhaps some conflicting and unhelpful medical advice from various sources, their own common sense, and their deepest protective instincts. Their own lives, their health, and their peace of mind were profoundly shaped and often disrupted by your unpredictable nocturnal travels. Their sleep patterns were chronically disturbed, their daytime energies depleted, their anxieties perpetually heightened, all in a constant, devoted effort to keep you from coming to harm in that deep, pervasive, and often threatening Georgian darkness. The complex rituals of locking doors, placing obstacles, and the anxious, sleepy restraints were not just about controlling your movements. They were fundamentally about preserving the fragile peace, order, and physical safety of the entire household. One creaking floorboard, one bolted door, one watchful night at a time. You continue your serene, if somewhat utterly aimless, somnambulistic promenade through the hushed, expectant corridors of the sleeping house. Perhaps you are unconsciously testing the structural efficacy of that newly installed, extra-strong iron bolt on the pantry door, your fingers fumbling ineffectually at its unyielding surface. Or maybe you are narrowly and with inexplicable grace avoiding the strategically placed shallow basin of icy cold water by your bedside, your bare feet somehow sensing its unwelcome presence just in time. But while your anxious family frets and loses sleep, and while learned physicians in their studies pontificate on humors and pen lengthy treatises on nervous distempers, another, more cynical and questioning perspective is slowly beginning to take root in certain corners of the Georgian mind. Profound skepticism. As increasingly sensational accounts of ever more elaborate and astonishing sleepwalking feats began to circulate, tales of individuals composing intricate symphonies in their sleep, solving complex philosophical conundrums overnight, engaging in lengthy, coherent, if somewhat bizarre conversations with witnesses, all while supposedly dead to the waking world. Some people, understandably, began to raise a quizzical, disbelieving eyebrow. Were all of these nocturnal wanderers genuinely, completely unconscious and unaware of their actions? Or were some of them, perhaps, shall we say, playing to the gallery, consciously or unconsciously exaggerating their condition for attention, sympathy, or some other advantage? The gradual rise of the doubting Thomas figure in relation to sleepwalking adds another intriguing and complicating layer to your shadowy, unremembered journey. This burgeoning skepticism wasn't entirely unfounded or simply a product of mean-spirited cynicism. The Georgian era, for all its residual fascinations with the mystical, the Gothic, and the uncanny, was also, concurrently, the great age of reason, an intellectual period that highly valued logic, empirical evidence, rational explanation, and a healthy distrust of unsupported claims. The more outlandish, theatrical, or conveniently timed the reported sleepwalking exploit, the more it strained the credulity of thoughtful, educated individuals. Could someone who struggled to compose a coherent shopping list while fully awake really dash off a perfectly rhyming, metrically sound sonnet in their sleep, as some accounts claimed? It seemed a bit too convenient, a bit too, well, theatrical. One can easily imagine a gouty old gentleman, a staunch upholder of common sense, reading an account in the Gentleman's Magazine or a local newspaper of a humble, uneducated sleepwalking milkmaid who supposedly delivered an impromptu but erudite lecture on Newtonian physics to her astonished and presumably equally uneducated cows, snorting dismissively into his morning cup of breakfast tea and declaring to his long-suffering wife, "Poppycock and fiddle-faddle, my dear. The girl's an out-and-out fraud, or her master is, clearly a ruse to gain notoriety or escape her chores." The distinct potential for malingering, that is, consciously feigning illness or incapacity for some perceived benefit, was already a well-recognized issue in other contexts of Georgian life. It was known to occur, for instance, among soldiers attempting to avoid arduous or dangerous military duty, among paupers seeking to elicit more generous charitable aid, or among individuals trying to escape irksome social or familial responsibilities. Why then should the phenomenon of sleepwalking be entirely different, entirely immune from such human tendencies? If being known as a sleepwalker somehow excused you from certain demanding daytime responsibilities, garnered you special attention, sympathy, or even a degree of awe from your peers, or more pragmatically, provided a wonderfully convenient and largely unchallengeable alibi for certain nocturnal activities you'd rather not have to explain, such as illicitly visiting a forbidden lover's chamber or conducting secret raids on the household liquor cabinet or the sweetmeat stores, then the temptation to perform a convincing bout of somnambulism might prove quite strong for certain less scrupulous or perhaps more imaginative individuals. It offered the ultimate, "it wasn't me, it was my subconscious" excuse. Centuries before Sigmund Freud and his theories made such notions intellectually fashionable and widely discussed. This undercurrent of suspicion regarding the genuineness of some reported cases was likely amplified and reinforced by the increasingly common and often highly dramatic stage portrayals of sleepwalking we discussed earlier. If professional actors on the London stage could so convincingly and movingly mimic the outward signs of somnambulism, the vacant stare, the stumbling gait, the muttered secrets, for the entertainment of a paying audience, why couldn't an ordinary person, looking for a particular advantage, a bit of excitement, or just a way to inject some drama into an otherwise mundane life, do the same? The very theatricality inherent in some of the more astonishing reported episodes, the timely and dramatic pronouncements, the almost preternatural skill demonstrated in navigating complex obstacles, sometimes but not always, the conveniently timed discoveries of hidden secrets or incriminating evidence. All of this could, to a more cynical or worldly wise observer, smell a bit too much like theatrical grease paint, carefully rehearsed gestures, and strategically placed footlights. "Oh, look, dear," a neighbor might whisper to her husband, observing their acquaintance Mrs. Pringle from across the street. "There she is, sleep-dusting the curate's prize-winning Ming vase again in the dead of night. Such extraordinary dedication to cleanliness, even in her deepest, most profound slumber. Or perhaps," the whisper might continue, a little less charitably, "she just wants poor Mr. Pringle and the rest of us to notice that she desperately needs a new, more expensive feather duster, or that the curate hasn't invited them to tea lately. One mainstream historical fact that undoubtedly underpinned this growing skepticism was the complete lack of any clear, objective, scientifically verifiable diagnostic criteria for genuine sleepwalking at the time. There were no sophisticated brain scans like EEGs or MRIs to monitor neural activity during sleep. There were no specialized sleep laboratories where subjects could be observed under controlled conditions. The diagnosis of somnambulism relied almost entirely on subjective witness accounts of the behavior, the individual's own, usually complete lack of, recall of the event, and the physician's clinical judgment based on observation of outward signs. This inherent subjectivity made it exceptionally difficult to definitively distinguish, with any real certainty, between a genuine, involuntary somnambulist and a clever, calculating actor who had perhaps read a few Gothic novels or seen a play. A physician might carefully observe the characteristic vacant stare, the apparent unresponsiveness to stimuli, and the automatic nature of the movements. But even these signs, it was acknowledged, could potentially be faked with enough skill, practice, and motivation. The burden of proof when malingering was suspected was exceptionally tricky. This growing tide of doubt and suspicion inevitably created a difficult and uncomfortable situation for genuine sleepwalkers and their already anxious families. Not only did they have to contend with the very real practical difficulties of managing the condition, the inherent physical dangers, and the lingering folkloric fears or superstitious beliefs surrounding it, but they might also find themselves facing hurtful accusations of deception, attention-seeking, or outright fraud. Imagine the profound frustration and distress of being genuinely afflicted by this strange, involuntary condition, perhaps terrified by your own nocturnal actions which you couldn't control or remember, only to be met not with sympathy and understanding, but with cold suspicion, thinly veiled disbelief, or even open mockery. "Oh, he's just putting it on for effect, you know," a skeptical neighbor or a dismissive relative might whisper behind their hand. "Always was one for the theatrics, that young man. Anything to avoid an honest day's work or to get himself noticed." A quirky tidbit that vividly illustrates this pervasive skepticism comes from various anecdotal accounts of people devising and implementing elaborate ruses or tests designed to catch out suspected sleep fakers, to expose their deception. These amateur detective efforts could involve things like making sudden, very loud noises, banging a tin tray, for example, near the sleepwalker to see if they startled or flinched in a way that indicated underlying wakefulness. A genuine sleepwalker is often, though not always, quite hard to rouse from their deep state. Or they might involve slyly placing unexpected and perhaps slightly dangerous or inconvenient obstacles directly in the sleepwalker's accustomed path to see if they miraculously avoided them with an open-eyed precision that belied their supposed unconsciousness. Sometimes, more subtle tricks were played, such as substituting familiar objects with unfamiliar ones, or giving deliberately false or misleading verbal information or instructions to see if the sleepwalker would react in a way that indicated an underlying awareness of the deception or an ability to process complex new information that should be beyond the capacity of someone truly asleep. These impromptu and probably very badly designed homespun science experiments, while perhaps understandable from a certain cynical perspective, could also be deeply distressing, embarrassing, or even potentially dangerous for the unfortunate person being surreptitiously tested, especially if they were genuinely in a somnambulistic state. It's rather like an uninvited and highly unqualified committee conducting an intrusive and possibly hazardous psychological experiment on you while you're just innocently trying to find your unconscious way to the imaginary cheese counter in the celestial grocery store of your dreams. Historians who study social attitudes and medical history still debate how pervasive this kind of skepticism actually was among the general populace versus within more educated medical or intellectual circles. It's highly likely that attitudes varied widely across different social classes, regions, and individual dispositions. Some people, perhaps those more naturally credulous, or those with a personal or family experience of inexplicable phenomena, likely remained entirely fascinated by and accepting of the mystery of sleepwalking. Others, perhaps those with a more rigorously scientific or inherently cynical bent of mind, or those who had unfortunately been duped by a clever charlatan or impostor in the past, were undoubtedly far more dubious and critical. The truth, as with so many complex human phenomena, probably lay somewhere in the nuanced middle ground. Genuine, involuntary sleepwalking was indeed a real and perplexing condition, but the distinct possibility of it being feigned or exaggerated for personal gain or dramatic attention was also widely acknowledged and often suspected. This persistent undercurrent of doubt, this nagging question of authenticity, would certainly have influenced how sleepwalking cases were reported in the press, discussed in polite society, and even assessed in medical consultations. A writer detailing a particularly astonishing or theatrical case of somnambulism might feel obliged to include certain caveats, to acknowledge the remote possibility of imposture, or to carefully emphasize the credibility of the witnesses. Physicians, when attempting to diagnose genuine somnambulism, might have found themselves being more cautious and rigorous in their examinations, perhaps looking for corroborating evidence from multiple sources, a consistent pattern of behavior over a long period, or the absence of any obvious motive for deception in order to try and rule out conscious fabrication. You are blameless. We must, of course, assume for the sake of our gentle narrative, nocturnal navigator, might find yourself subjected to an extra, unwelcome level of intense scrutiny from those around you. Your every unconscious twitch, every mumbled word, every seemingly inexplicable nocturnal journey might be meticulously analyzed, not just for medical clues or signs of spiritual disturbance, but also for subtle, telltale signs of deceit. The world around you is no longer just watching your strange performances with simple wonder, anxious fear, or scientific curiosity, but now, perhaps, also with a narrowing, deeply appraising, and fundamentally suspicious gaze. Are you truly, helplessly lost in the bewildering, shadowy labyrinth of deep sleep, they wonder? Or are you just a very, very convincing actor, entirely lost in your self-scripted role? As you continue your unconscious and often remarkably quiet journey through the darkened passageways, perhaps blissfully unaware of the presence of any doubting Thomases and their potentially skeptical, scrutinizing glares, the broader intellectual currents of the later Georgian era are slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to shift the dominant lens through which your perplexing condition is viewed and understood by the more educated segments of society. While deep-rooted superstition and traditional folklore certainly hadn't vanished entirely from the popular mind, and while many physicians still clung tenaciously to aspects of older theories involving humors, spirits, and lunar influences, the Enlightenment's pervasive emphasis on reason, empirical observation, systematic classification, and the determined search for natural rather than supernatural explanations for all phenomena was gradually gaining significant traction in intellectual circles. The sustained attempt to bring a more rational, materialist, and scientific understanding to the enduring mysteries of human slumber, including your peculiar nocturnal habit of, say, meticulously rearranging the household linen into complex geometric patterns, marks a subtle but undeniably significant turning point in the long history of how such behaviors were perceived and interpreted. The late 18th and early 19th centuries witnessed the burgeoning of what we might now recognize as the very early, embryonic forms of psychology and neurology as distinct fields of study, though these disciplines were still very far from being formally established or clearly differentiated from general medicine or moral philosophy. Thinkers, physicians, and natural philosophers of this period were becoming increasingly interested in the physical mechanics of the brain and the intricate workings of the nervous system, even if their available tools for direct investigation were still exceedingly rudimentary, relying mostly on anatomical dissection of cadavers, observations of behavior in the living, and a great deal of ingenious, if often unverifiable, theoretical speculation. Instead of attributing baffling conditions like sleepwalking solely to the influence of wayward spirits, divine punishment, an imbalance of ancient invisible humors, or the malign influence of the moon, some more forward-thinking individuals were beginning to actively look for underlying causes within the physical human organism itself. Terms like cerebral irritation, disordered nervous function, sympathetic nervous influence, or a morbid state of the sensorium started to appear with greater frequency in medical discussions and scholarly publications, suggesting a discernible, if still very tentative and often vaguely defined, move towards a more physiological, more body-centered, if still profoundly incomplete understanding of such phenomena. You weren't necessarily possessed by a demon or bewitched by a neighbor. Your brain, that complex and still largely mysterious organ, was just having a minor, localized, and rather mobile functional hiccup. One of the key intellectual shifts characteristic of this period was the passionate desire to classify, categorize, and systematize all aspects of the natural world, including human diseases and afflictions. Just as pioneering naturalists like Carl Linnaeus were meticulously cataloging and naming plants and animals, creating vast ordered systems, physicians were similarly attempting to create ever more refined and comprehensive nosologies, formal systems of disease classification, that sought to include and differentiate various disorders of sleep and consciousness. Sleepwalking, or somnambulismus might find itself grouped within these complex charts and tables alongside other conditions then considered paroxysms, sudden episodic attacks, or convulsive disorders, not necessarily in the sense of a full-blown epileptic seizure involving violent motor convulsions, but rather as an involuntary, episodic, and disruptive disturbance of normal bodily and mental function. This dedicated attempt at careful systematization and logical categorization, however imperfect, often inaccurate by modern standards, and still laden with older theoretical baggage it may have been, was nonetheless a crucial conceptual step towards demystifying the condition of sleepwalking. It represented an effort to move it, slowly but surely, from the shadowy realm of the purely uncanny, the inexplicable, and the morally judged, into the more brightly lit, or at least less dimly lit, category of a potentially diagnosable, if still very poorly understood medical issue that might one day be amenable to rational treatment. No, no, my dear vicar, a progressive-minded physician might gently admonish. It is not, I assure you, a mischievous goblin residing in his gray matter, nor a sign of divine displeasure. It is, in my considered opinion, clearly a case of noctambulation simplex, as described by the learned Dr. Cullen, possibly exacerbated, I grant you, by an unfortunate overindulgence in undigested parsnips before retiring. The case for now is closed, pending further observation and perhaps a change in diet. This period also saw a notably increased emphasis on the importance of careful, detailed observation and the systematic collection and comparison of case studies, a trend we've already noted in the context of earlier medical practice. However, the interpretation of these collected cases began, at least in some more enlightened and intellectually curious quarters, to lean more heavily towards identifying underlying patterns, searching for potential physiological triggers, and trying to discern any hereditary predispositions, rather than simply cataloging a list of bizarre behaviors or attributing them to broad, untestable theories. For instance, tentative connections were sometimes drawn by observant physicians between the occurrence of sleepwalking in an individual and a history of other nervous conditions, such as hysteria, vapors, or melancholy, within their immediate family. This hinted at the emerging, though still very vaguely formulated, idea of hereditary factors playing a role, even if the actual mechanism of such inheritance, what we would now understand through genetics, was entirely unknown and unimagined. If your eccentric great-aunt Matilda also had a well-known penchant for sleep-weeding the local vicar's prize-winning tulips under the light of the full moon, it might be seen by a more modern-thinking doctor less as evidence of a recurring family curse or a shared lunar susceptibility, and more as an indication of a delicate family nervous constitution being passed down through the generations. A mainstream historical fact that influenced medical thinking in this era was the widespread discussion and impact of emerging physiological theories about irritability and sensibility in living tissues. These concepts, pioneered by prominent European scientists like Albrecht von Haller, while often complex and debated in their specifics, generally suggested that living organisms, and particularly their nervous systems, possessed an inherent capacity to respond to various internal and external stimuli in predictable, if sometimes overly sensitive or exaggerated ways. From this perspective, sleepwalking could be interpreted not as a spiritual problem, but as an exaggerated, inappropriate, or disordered physiological response of the nervous system during the particular and altered state of sleep. Perhaps certain subtle internal stimuli, like the pressure of a full bladder, the discomfort of indigestion from that infamous cheese, or even a minor muscle ache, or even very slight and usually unnoticed external ones. A slight change in room temperature, a distant muffled noise, a particular quality of moonlight filtering through the curtains, could trigger the unusually irritable or oversensitive sleeping brain into initiating complex coordinated motor activity without the participation or awareness of full consciousness. It's still a far cry from modern neuroscience as we understand it, with its focus on specific brain regions, neurotransmitters, and sleep stages like NREM and REM. But it represents a significant conceptual shift towards thinking in terms of underlying biological mechanisms, rather than invoking external magical or moralistic forces. However, as the Georgian era, with its distinctive cultural and intellectual flavor, began slowly to draw to its eventual close around the 1830s, this admirable intellectual quest for more rational and scientific explanations for phenomena like sleepwalking did not, unfortunately, mean that the condition became any less mysterious or baffling in actual day-to-day practice, or any easier to treat effectively. While the formal language used by physicians and scholars to describe it might have been gradually evolving towards a more recognizably scientific or medicalized terminology, the actual deep understanding of what was physically happening within the brain during a sleepwalking episode remained profoundly elusive. There were still many competing, often contradictory theories in circulation, and the prescribed treatments, as we've seen, remained largely empirical, based on trial and error rather than proven efficacy, often completely ineffective, sometimes harmful, and occasionally, from our modern viewpoint, downright bizarre and counterproductive. The historical transition from predominantly supernatural or metaphysical explanations for perplexing human conditions towards more consistently naturalistic and physiological ones was not a sudden, clean flip of an intellectual switch, but rather a slow, messy, uneven, and often contested process spanning many decades. For every forward-thinking physician in London or Edinburgh earnestly discussing disordered cerebral pathways or morbid excitement of the sensorium, there was likely a traditional village healer or a country apothecary still confidently recommending a poultice made of dubious local herbs and a solemnly whispered ancient incantation as the best remedy for walking in the night. Historians who study the evolution of medical thought and practice still argue whether these late Georgian attempts at achieving a more scientific and rational understanding of sleepwalking genuinely improved the overall lot, or the lived experience, of actual sleepwalkers and their families during this period. Or did it perhaps in some cases simply replace one set of baffling and often stigmatizing labels with another, slightly more modern-sounding but equally unhelpful set? Being formally diagnosed by a learned man of science with disordered nervous sensibility manifesting as nocturnal perambulation might have sounded more sophisticated and less alarming to some than being informally told by your neighbors that you're moonstruck or touched by fairies. But if the available treatments remain just as ineffective, if the social stigma and fear persisted largely unchanged, and if the disruption to your life and your family's life continued unabated, then one might reasonably ask, had much of real, practical substance actually changed for the poor individual still found doing the midnight meandering in their nightshirt? A quirky tidbit relating to this era's slowly evolving thought processes and the growing medicalization of unusual behaviors. Some of the early alienists, the 18th and 19th century precursors to modern psychiatrists, who were beginning to work in the newly developing, though often still rather grim, asylums and madhouses, started to take a more systematic observational interest in phenomena like sleepwalking as part of a broader, more general study of altered mental states and diseases of the mind. They meticulously observed and documented institutionalized patients who exhibited somnambulism, often alongside other more severe psychiatric conditions such as melancholia, mania, or dementia. The precise nature of the connection, if any, between sleepwalking and these other conditions was usually very poorly understood and often misinterpreted. However, this professional attention did, slowly but surely, begin to draw the phenomenon of sleepwalking further into the recognized medical sphere, gradually pulling it away from purely folkloric, religious, or moral interpretations. This occurred even if it sometimes risked mischaracterizing or over-pathologizing sleepwalking by associating it too closely with more severe forms of mental derangement. One can almost picture a case note from such an institution. Patient X, admitted last Tuesday, presents with profound melancholia, a distressing tendency to converse animatedly with the pigeons in the asylum courtyard, and frequent, well-documented nocturnal perambulations to the scullery, where he attempts to polish the copper pots with his own socks. We shall prescribe a bracing regime of regular cold baths, a phrenological assessment to determine the seat of the disorder, and perhaps a course of gentle purges. As the flickering, smoky gas lights slowly began to replace the dimmer, less reliable oil lamps in the streets and homes of the very late Georgian and early Victorian periods, and as empirical science, with its emphasis on observation, experimentation, and measurement, continued its inexorable, if sometimes rather stumbling and circuitous march forward, the deep, almost impenetrable darkness that had for so long shrouded your nightly wanderings, both in a literal and a metaphorical sense, was beginning, just barely perceptibly, to recede. The prevailing explanations for your strange habit were still often incomplete, frequently contradictory, and almost always heavily laced with the persistent remnants of older, more traditional beliefs and superstitions. But the determined intellectual effort to understand sleepwalking as a natural, albeit highly unusual and still deeply perplexing human phenomenon, one that might eventually yield its secrets to rational inquiry, was undeniably taking hold and gaining momentum. Your quiet, unconscious journey through the darkened house is occurring at a fascinating transitional time, a period when many of the old certainties about the world and the human condition are fading, and new, ostensibly more rational and scientific explanations are being actively sought for even the strangest and most unsettling of human behaviors. Even if true clarity, genuine understanding, and effective treatments are still many decades and many crucial scientific breakthroughs away, the profound mysteries of the sleeping mind and its occasional tendency to take the body on unscripted adventures remained largely unsolved. But the collective will to explore them with new intellectual tools and a spirit of empirical inquiry was definitely and irreversibly awakening. And so, your long unconscious journey through the shadowy, uncertain, and often perilous world of the archetypal Georgian sleepwalker is now drawing to its gentle, somnolent close. You've navigated in our shared imagination the profound, almost tangible darkness of pre-industrial nights, a blackness most of us can barely conceive of today. You've felt the persistent seeping chill of unheated hallways and cold stone floors on your bare, unfeeling feet. You have been, in spirit, the subject of anxious, whispered family discussions, the recipient of bizarre and often alarming remedies, and the focus of the first hesitant stirrings of scientific curiosity about the hidden workings of the mind. As the first faint, ethereal gray light of a new dawn begins almost imperceptibly to seep through a tiny chink in the heavy bedroom curtains, or to illuminate the grime on a window pane, hinting at the imminent end of your nightly, unremembered ramble, we can pause to reflect on how those Georgian curiosities, fears, and tentative explanations resonate, however faintly, with our own modern understanding of sleep and its many associated parasomnias. The Georgians, armed with their limited tools of inquiry, their observations, their speculative theories, their often misguided treatments, were grappling earnestly with profound mysteries of the human mind that we, in many fundamental ways, are still striving to fully unravel today, albeit with the vastly more sophisticated instruments of neuroscience, polysomnography, and genetic research, rather than with leeches, humoral charts, and confident Latin pronouncements. The image of you, the sleepwalker, a figure moving with an eerie, often unnerving, dissociated grace, your eyes open but unseeing, your purpose obscure, undoubtedly haunted the Georgian imagination. They perceived in your nocturnal activities a strange and unsettling breach of the natural, God-given order of things, a living, walking embodiment of the thin, permeable veil that separates the world of waking reality from the elusive, often chaotic realm of dreaming, the state of full consciousness from its mysterious absence. Your actions, whether as mundane as repeatedly tidying an already tidy room, or as dramatic and inexplicable as attempting to scale the high garden wall in your nightclothes, were meticulously, almost obsessively, scrutinized by those around you for some deeper meaning, for elusive clues to the inner workings of a human mind temporarily, and alarmingly, off its customary leash. They might have blamed your wanderings on an unfortunate overindulgence in cheese, the cyclical influence of the full moon, an imbalance of your vital animal spirits, or even the subtle machinations of unseen mischievous entities. But at the very core of their enduring fascination, their fear and their endless speculation was a fundamental, timeless human question. one that echoes down to our own time. What exactly happens to us, to our essential sense of self, when we sleep? Where does the conscious, reasoning self go when we succumb to slumber? And what, if anything, takes over the controls when it's gone? That's a profound existential question we still ponder today, even if we now frame it more clinically in terms of REM versus NREM sleep stages, complex non-REM parasomnias, genetic predispositions, and imbalances in specific neurotransmitter systems. Think for a moment of those early, often fumbling medical attempts to classify, understand, and treat your condition. Crude, sometimes laughable as they may appear to us now, the very act of classifying somnambulism under emerging medical categories like neuroses, nervous affections, or disorders of the sensorium was a hesitant but crucial step towards recognizing it primarily as a medical or physiological issue, rather than solely as a moral failing, a sign of demonic possession, or a supernatural curse. This represented the beginning of a long, slow, often tortuous path leading eventually to the development of modern sleep medicine as a recognized specialty. The detailed case histories that physicians and interested lay observers painstakingly compiled, though frequently laced with the inescapable biases, cultural assumptions, and theoretical preconceptions of their era, nevertheless provided an invaluable foundation of observed phenomena, a repository of raw data for future generations to analyze with more sophisticated tools. One important historical fact that is often overlooked in our rush to judge the past by present standards is that this very act of meticulous observation, documentation, and attempted classification, even when undertaken without full understanding or effective solutions, is a fundamental hallmark of emerging scientific progress. They were diligently collecting data points, describing patterns, and noting anomalies, even if they didn't always know what to do with the information, or often drew incorrect conclusions from it. Your seemingly random, pointless nighttime rearrangement of the family silver, or your attempts to converse with the ancestral portraits, might have, in some small, indirect way, contributed to a perplexed doctor's detailed notes, which in turn became part of a larger, slowly evolving picture of human neurological diversity. The manifold fears and deeply ingrained superstitions that often surrounded you, the sleepwalker, the widely held beliefs that you might be temporarily possessed by an errant spirit, actively bewitched by a malevolent neighbor, or simply an unlucky soul whose own spirit was prone to restless wandering, highlight the profound and enduring human need to find coherent explanations for the inexplicable, the unsettling, and the frightening. In a world with far less scientific certainty and readily available information than our own, the supernatural, the magical, and the religious often provided a ready-made, culturally sanctioned framework for understanding and responding to such phenomena. We might chuckle today at the earnest recommendation of warding off sleepwalking by placing a live toad in a bag around one's neck, or by sleeping with a sprig of rue under the pillow. But such practices, however bizarre they seem to us, speak eloquently to a deep-seated human desire to exert some form of control, however symbolic, over a frightening, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous phenomenon. Our modern equivalents of these protective rituals might be less earthy and overtly magical, perhaps involving carefully curated sleep hygiene routines, the avoidance of blue light from electronic screens for hours before bedtime, the use of white noise machines, or pervasive anxiety about getting our prescribed 8 hours of uninterrupted slumber. But the underlying fundamental human desire for restful, safe, uninterrupted, and reliably contained sleep remains a powerful and constant driver of behavior. You certainly wouldn't want your smart speaker, activated by your sleep talking, To accidentally order an entire herd of live elephants or a lifetime supply of pickled onions while you're innocently sleep browsing the internet in the dead of night, would you? And what of the varied societal and familial responses to your nocturnal activities? The securely locked bedroom doors, the exhausting, anxious family vigils that stretch through countless nights, the sometimes heated debates in solemn courtrooms about legal culpability and diminished responsibility for actions committed while asleep. These all echo very real concerns that we still grapple with in modern society, albeit often in different legal and medical contexts. How do we ensure the physical safety of individuals who experience complex parasomnias like sleepwalking or night terrors? What are the precise legal implications of actions, sometimes even violent ones, performed during such dissociated states of consciousness? While our contemporary solutions are, one hopes, generally more nuanced, evidence-based, and less reliant on simply tying someone physically to a bedpost or dosing them with powerful addictive opiates, the core underlying issues of personal responsibility, compassionate care, public safety, and the limits of conscious control persist and continue to be debated by medical professionals, legal scholars, and ethicists. Historians who study these periods still engage in lively debate about whether the Georgian era was, on balance, more or less humane or enlightened in its treatment of individuals with unusual mental or behavioral conditions. It was, almost certainly, a complex and often contradictory mixture of deeply felt harshness and genuine compassion, burgeoning scientific understanding and profound, bewildered ignorance. The figure of the sleepwalker, as depicted with such flair in Georgian popular literature and theatrical melodramas, often highly romanticized, sensationalized, or gothicized, undeniably cemented a particular and enduring image in the public consciousness. Lady Macbeth's anguished, guilt-ridden wanderings, though a product of an earlier age, became the powerful archetype against which many later literary and real-life sleepwalkers were implicitly or explicitly measured. This enduring cultural impact highlights how artistic and media representations can profoundly shape and sometimes significantly distort our collective understanding and misunderstanding of various medical or psychological conditions. Today we might get our misinformation about sleepwalking not from a 3-volume Gothic novel about a somnambulistic heiress who conveniently discovers a hidden will in a dusty attic, but perhaps from a sensationalized television drama featuring a sleepwalking murderer, or a viral internet video of someone performing an amusing but ultimately trivial act while asleep. But the fundamental power of storytelling, in all its forms, to frame, interpret, and often simplify complex human phenomena for public consumption, endures across the centuries. You were, in a strange and public way, an unwitting, unpaid celebrity of the twilight world, a star of a nightly drama you never remembered performing. As the pale, insistent light outside your Georgian window strengthens further, beginning to cast long, tentative shadows across the dusty floorboards and signaling the true arrival of morning, the strange urgency of your unconscious mission, whatever it may have been, seems to visibly fade. The tangible, demanding world of definite shapes, sharp sounds, and waking human responsibilities is about to reclaim you fully. The peculiar, dreamlike logic that guided your intricate steps through the profound darkness will soon dissipate like morning mist under a rising sun, leaving you upon waking with no clear memory of your nocturnal adventures. You might awaken with only a vague, inexplicable sense of fatigue, a few mysterious tender bruises on your shins or arms, an unaccountably misplaced object by your bedside, or perhaps just the faint, lingering scent of beeswax from that peculiar dream where you thought you were meticulously trying to polish the rather uncooperative family cat. The Georgians looked at you, the sleepwalker, and they saw a profound, unsettling enigma. They saw the utterly familiar transformed instantly and inexplicably into the deeply strange. They witnessed the ordinary human body, usually governed by reason and conscious will, suddenly animated by some unseen, unknowable, and perhaps uncontrollable internal force. In your nightly wanderings, they sensed they were looking at the very frontiers of the human mind, a mysterious borderland where rational thought slept soundly and other older, wilder, and more primitive things might perhaps stir and take temporary command. We, today, with our sophisticated sleep clinics, our advanced brain imaging technologies, and our growing understanding of neurochemistry, have painstakingly mapped some parts of that shadowy frontier. But the vast, intricate landscape of sleep, much like the deep, unlit, and often dangerous nights of the bygone Georgian era, still holds many of its deepest secrets, its quiet, lingering mysteries, and its enduring capacity to surprise, fascinate, and occasionally profoundly unsettle us. The gentle, or perhaps not so gentle art of your ancestors' sleepwalking in all its perplexing, sometimes amusing, and often frightening detail, has, I hope, shown us a world that was perhaps less certain, more imbued with mystery, and in some ways more overtly frightening than our own. But it was also a world that was deeply, recognizably human in its persistent, fumbling, and often poignant attempts to comprehend the elusive shadows that dwell within us all. And now, as the fading echoes of those distant, creaking Georgian floorboards, and those ancient whispered theories of souls and humors begin to soften and recede into the quiet background of your mind, let yourself drift easily and peacefully. The compelling mysteries of their long-ago nights are gently giving way to the profound, simple quiet of your own present moment. Feel the steady, reassuring rhythm of your own breathing, in and out, a calm and natural cadence. Sense the comforting, gentle weight of your blankets around you, a soft embrace. Notice the quiet, enveloping stillness that surrounds you in your own safe space. The sleepwalkers of that distant, bygone era have played their shadowy part in our shared story tonight. Their silent, often perilous, spectral movements have, perhaps, illuminated a small, forgotten corner of the vast tapestry of human experience. A quiet testament to the enduring, fundamental questions we continue to ask about ourselves, about our minds, and about the nature of consciousness. Even in the deepest, most oblivious hours of rest, there are no more dark, unfamiliar corridors for you to navigate tonight. There are no perplexing, dream-driven choices to be made, guided by the unseen, silent currents of slumber. Only peace, deep comfort, and the soft, inviting embrace of approaching sleep. The anxieties and concerns of that distant, candlelit Georgian world can now recede entirely from your awareness, replaced by an overwhelming sense of calm, tranquility, and profound ease. Let your mind become wonderfully still and undisturbed as a forgotten, dust-mote-filled Georgian hallway in the deepest, most silent hour before the dawn. Let go now of all conscious thought, release all lingering effort, and allow yourself to sink deeper and still deeper into comfortable, restorative repose. The story is now fully told. Rest now. Sleep deeply.